Hello there, and welcome to Biology with Charles, where curiosity slows down a little, the lights dim just enough, and science takes the long way around. Wherever you're listening from tonight, whether it's late evening, early morning, or some quiet moment borrowed from the middle of the day, you're very welcome here. This is a space for thinking gently, not urgently. A place where we look closely at everyday human behaviour without judgment, without rush, and without pretending that answers always arrive on schedule. Before we settle in, let me ask you something simple. Where are you listening from right now? And what is it that you are supposed to be doing instead? Perhaps something small, perhaps something important, perhaps something that has been sitting just out of reach for a while, quietly waiting. If that question lands a little too close to home, don't worry. You're very much in the right place. Tonight, we're going to spend some time with a habit so familiar that it almost disappears into the background of daily life. A habit many people joke about, criticize themselves for, promise to fix tomorrow, and then somehow repeat again the next day. Procrastination. Not the dramatic kind with deadlines crashing down and last-minute heroics, but the quieter version. The email left unopened. The task postponed until after one more video. The plan that always seems easier to think about later. Procrastination has a reputation problem. It's often framed as laziness, poor discipline, or a personal flaw. A failure of willpower. Something you just need to push through if you really care enough. But biology, psychology, and neuroscience tell a different story. One that is less about character and more about how the human brain works when faced with effort, uncertainty, emotion, and time. And that story turns out to be far more interesting and far more human than most productivity advice would have you believe. If you find this kind of slow, thoughtful exploration calming or useful, you're welcome to like the video or subscribe to the channel. It helps this space reach people who might need a quieter approach to understanding themselves. And if you're listening to unwind or fall asleep, don't worry about catching every detail. Nothing here needs to be memorized. The ideas will circle back in their own time. Now, procrastination is something nearly everyone recognizes immediately, yet struggles to define clearly. We say we procrastinate when we delay doing something we know we should do, but that definition hides more than it reveals. Because not all delay is procrastination. Waiting for the right information, resting before starting a demanding task, or choosing to do one responsibility before another are not failures of self-control, they're decisions. Procrastination, by contrast, is a specific kind of delay. It's when we put something off despite knowing that the delay will likely make things harder later. That detail matters, because it tells us that procrastination isn't about ignorance. It's not that we don't know the task matters. It's not that we've forgotten. It's not even that we've made a careful choice to postpone. More often, it's something else entirely. A tension between what we want right now and what we believe will matter later. A quiet internal negotiation that usually ends with a familiar phrase, "I'll do it after this." The interesting question isn't why people sometimes procrastinate. Given the way the human brain evolved, the surprising thing would be if we never did. The question is why procrastination feels so automatic, so resistant to logic, and so strangely comforting in the moment, even when it reliably creates stress, guilt, and regret afterward. To understand that, we need to step away from calendars and to-do lists and look instead at the brain itself. Not the brain as an abstract idea, but the brain as a biological system shaped by millions of years of survival pressures. A system designed to conserve energy, avoid danger, and prioritize immediate needs. A system that did not evolve to manage inboxes, long-term projects, or open-ended goals with unclear rewards. From a biological perspective, effort is expensive. Thinking deeply, planning ahead, and persisting through discomfort all require energy. The brain, which consumes a disproportionate amount of the body's resources, is constantly making calculations about what is worth that cost. When a task feels difficult, emotionally uncomfortable, boring or uncertain, the brain doesn't interpret it as important. It interprets it as costly. At the same time, the brain is highly sensitive to immediate relief, small rewards, familiar pleasures, the reduction of discomfort. When you delay a task you don't want to do, something interesting happens. The anxiety or resistance you are feeling eases, at least temporarily. That relief is real, it's measurable, and the brain learns from it. This is one of the reasons procrastination can feel so hard to break. It works in the short term. It makes the present moment feel better. And the brain is very good at remembering what makes the present moment easier, even if the long-term consequences are negative. Another part of the puzzle has to do with how we experience time. From the inside, time does not feel like a straight, evenly spaced line. The future feels vague, distant, less real than the present moment. When we imagine future-y us dealing with the consequences of today's delay, the brain often treats that future self almost like a different person, someone abstract, someone we assume will have more energy, more motivation, and fewer distractions than we do right now. This separation between present self and future self isn't a philosophical idea. It shows up in brain imaging studies. When people think about their future selves, many of the same brain regions activate as when they think about other people. That means procrastination isn't just about self-control, it's also about empathy, or rather a lack of it directed toward the person we will become. So when you tell yourself you'll start tomorrow, you're not just postponing a task. You're handing responsibility to a version of yourself your brain doesn't fully identify with. A version that feels hypothetical enough to disappoint without immediate consequences. This becomes especially powerful when combined with emotion. Tasks we procrastinate on are rarely neutral. They're tied to fear of failure, fear of judgment, uncertainty about where to start, or doubts about our ability to do the task well. The brain doesn't process these as abstract concerns. It processes them as threats, not life-threatening ones, but threats to self-image, competence, and social standing. Avoiding the task avoids those feelings, for now. And this is where the idea that procrastination is just laziness begins to fall apart. Laziness implies a lack of caring. Procrastination often happens precisely because we care too much about doing well, about not making mistakes, about how the outcome reflects on us. The brain, faced with that emotional weight, chooses delay as a form of protection. There's also the matter of how modern environments interact with ancient neural wiring. The world we live in is saturated with immediate rewards, notifications, entertainment, social feedback, endless streams of information. These are not neutral. They are highly effective at capturing attention and delivering small bursts of satisfaction. From the brain's perspective, they are easy wins. When a difficult task sits next to an easy distraction, the choice is rarely made through conscious deliberation. It's made through habit, impulse, and emotional regulation. The brain reaches for what feels manageable, not what is objectively important. This doesn't mean people who procrastinate are broken or uniquely flawed. It means they are human, operating with a brain that prioritizes comfort, certainty, and immediacy. A brain that was never designed for the kind of sustained, abstract effort modern life often demands. You may have noticed that procrastination doesn't show up evenly across all areas of life. Some tasks are done promptly, even eagerly. Others are delayed repeatedly. This inconsistency is another clue that procrastination is not a global personality trait. It's context-dependent, task-dependent, emotion-dependent. We rarely procrastinate on things that feel clear, rewarding, and well-defined. We tend to procrastinate on tasks that are ambiguous, open-ended, or emotionally charged. Tasks where it's unclear what done looks like. Tasks that carry the risk of evaluation. Tasks that require sustained attention without immediate feedback. Understanding this shifts the question from why am I like this to what is this task asking of my brain? and that shift opens the door to much more practical, compassionate solutions. But before we talk about changing anything, it's worth spending time simply noticing how procrastination actually unfolds. Not as a dramatic failure, but as a series of very small moments. A decision to check something quickly, a thought that you'll feel more ready later, a sense that now isn't quite the right time. These moments often pass without comment, yet they shape days, weeks, and sometimes years. Procrastination isn't usually a single choice, it's a pattern. And like most patterns in human behavior, it's built from repetition. Each time delay brings relief, the brain strengthens the association. Each time a task is completed under pressure at the last minute, the brain learns that waiting is survivable, sometimes even effective. That lesson sticks, even when the stress and exhaustion that accompany it are quietly accumulating. If any of this feels familiar, there's nothing here that needs fixing immediately. Awareness comes first. Understanding comes next. Change, if it comes at all, tends to arrive gradually, through shifts in how tasks are framed, environments are shaped, and expectations are set. For now, it's enough to recognize that procrastination is not a moral failure. It's a biological and psychological response to perceived difficulty, emotional discomfort, and time distortion. A response that makes sense given the machinery involved, even when it causes trouble. As we move forward, we'll take a closer look at how the brain weighs effort against reward, why motivation is often misunderstood, and how small adjustments can make starting feel less threatening. Not through force, but through alignment. Not by fighting the brain, but by working with it. If you've been listening while putting something off, there's no need to stop. The task will still be there later. For now, just stay with the idea that waiting isn't always a failure of will. Sometimes it's a signal, and learning to read that signal is where things begin to shift, almost without noticing. When people talk about procrastination, they usually talk past it. The word gets used loosely, almost casually, to describe any moment when something isn't done as soon as it could have been. A report submitted a day late, a message answered hours after it arrives, a plan postponed until next week. In everyday language, delay and procrastination are treated as the same thing. But from a psychological and biological point of view, they are not even close. To understand procrastination clearly, the first thing we need to do is separate it from several behaviors it is often confused with. Because if everything becomes procrastination, then nothing is. And once the concept loses its boundaries, it stops being useful for understanding why it happens and what, if anything, can be done about it. Let's start with delay. Delay is neutral, sometimes it's even sensible. Waiting for more information before making a decision is delay. Resting before beginning a mentally demanding task is delay. Choosing to work on one responsibility before another is delay. None of these involve internal conflict, none involve self-reproach, and none involve the uneasy feeling that you're acting against your own interests. Procrastination does. That tension is the defining feature. Procrastination occurs when you voluntarily postpone an intended action, despite knowing that the delay is likely to make things worse. Not harder in some abstract way, but worse in ways you already understand. More stress, less time, lower quality, more pressure later on. And yet the delay happens anyway. This detail matters because it tells us procrastination is not about poor planning or ignorance. People who procrastinate are usually very aware of what they're doing. They know the task is important. They know delaying won't help in the long run. They often know exactly what the consequences will be. And still, something pulls them away. That something is where procrastination actually lives. Another behavior often mistaken for procrastination is indecision. Indecision happens when you genuinely don't know what to do. You lack clarity, information, or confidence in the available options. You hesitate because the choice itself feels unresolved. Procrastination, by contrast, often shows up after the decision has already been made. You know what you're supposed to do. The uncertainty isn't about the choice, it's about the experience of carrying it out. There's also avoidance, which overlaps with procrastination but isn't identical. Avoidance is broader. It includes staying away from people, situations, or thoughts that feel threatening or unpleasant. Procrastination is a specific form of avoidance directed at tasks and responsibilities. It's avoidance with a schedule attached, or rather, avoidance that quietly rewrites the schedule. Then there's laziness, a label that's often applied quickly and rarely examined. Laziness implies a lack of desire to exert effort, a lack of caring, a preference for doing nothing. But procrastination doesn't usually look like that from the inside. Most people who procrastinate are not relaxed or indifferent. They're tense, distracted, mentally preoccupied. The task they're avoiding stays present, often hovering in the background, creating guilt rather than peace. If procrastination was simply laziness, putting things off would feel good all the way through, but it rarely does. There's relief at first, yes, but it's usually followed by discomfort, self-criticism, and a growing sense of pressure. That emotional pattern tells us procrastination is not about choosing pleasure over work. It's about choosing short-term emotional relief over long-term well-being. This brings us closer to what procrastination actually is. At its core, procrastination is an emotion regulation strategy. Not a particularly effective one, but a very common one. When a task triggers uncomfortable feelings, anxiety, boredom, self-doubt, resentment, confusion, the brain looks for a way to reduce that discomfort. Delaying the task does exactly that, at least temporarily. The moment you decide, I'll do it later, the emotional intensity drops. The pressure eases. The discomfort recedes just enough to feel manageable. The brain registers this reduction in discomfort as a reward, not a big one. Not the kind associated with joy or excitement, but a quiet, reliable one. And the brain learns quickly from rewards, especially ones tied to relief. This is why procrastination can become habitual even when it consistently causes problems. From the brain's point of view, it's doing its job. It's reducing distress in the present moment. The fact that it creates more distress later is not weighed as heavily, because the future is less vivid, less urgent, and less emotionally charged than what you're feeling right now. This doesn't mean procrastination is a conscious choice to feel better. Most of the time, it isn't experienced as a choice at all. It feels automatic. You sit down to begin, you hesitate, something pulls your attention elsewhere, and before you've fully noticed what's happening, you're doing something else. That automatic quality is important. Procrastination is rarely the result of deliberate reasoning. It's the result of quick, emotionally driven decisions made below the level of conscious awareness. Decisions shaped by past experiences, habits, and expectations about how the task will feel. Another misconception is that procrastination is about poor time management. This idea has fueled countless planners, apps, and scheduling systems, and while organization can help in some cases, it often misses the point. Many people who procrastinate are very capable of managing time. They meet deadlines, they juggle responsibilities, they know how long things take. Their problem is not time blindness, it's task aversion. You can schedule a task perfectly and still avoid it. You can block out hours and still find yourself drifting away. Because procrastination isn't about not knowing when to work. It's about not wanting to experience what the work evokes. This also explains why advice like just start or break it into smaller steps sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. Those strategies reduce the emotional load of the task. They make it feel less threatening, less overwhelming. When they work, it's not because they improve discipline, it's because they change how the task feels to the brain. Procrastination also isn't a fixed trait. People often say, "I'm a procrastinator," as if it were a stable part of their personality. But procrastination varies dramatically across contexts. Someone might delay writing emails but have no trouble exercising. They might avoid studying but eagerly work on creative projects. They They might procrastinate at work, but not at home, or vice versa. This variability tells us procrastination is not who you are. It's how you respond to certain kinds of demands that feel ambiguous, emotionally risky, or misaligned with your current energy and expectations. There's also a persistent myth that procrastination means you don't care enough. But again, the evidence points in the opposite direction. People are more likely to procrastinate on tasks that matter to them. Tasks tied to identity, performance, or evaluation. Tasks where failure feels personal. When the stakes are high, the emotional weight increases. That weight makes avoidance more tempting. Not because the person doesn't care, but because they care so much that the possibility of not meeting their own standards becomes hard to tolerate. This is why perfectionism and procrastination so often travel together. Perfectionism raises the emotional cost of starting. It turns the task into a test rather than a process. And when starting feels like stepping into judgment, delay becomes a form of self-protection. Another thing procrastination is not, is rebellion against responsibility, at least not in the way it's often framed. It's tempting to see procrastination as defiance, a refusal to comply with external demands. But most procrastination happens even when no one else is watching, even when the only person affected is the procrastinator themselves. That suggests the conflict isn't primarily with authority or obligation. It's internal, between different parts of the self with different priorities, the part that wants relief now and the part that wants stability later, the part that avoids discomfort and the part that understands consequences. Psychologically, this can feel like being pulled in two directions at once. You want to do the task, you also want to avoid it. Both impulses are real, both make sense given the circumstances, and the brain resolves that conflict by favouring the impulse that reduces immediate discomfort. It's also worth saying what procrastination is not doing. It's not a sign that you lack intelligence. Some of the most capable, creative, and accomplished people struggle with it deeply. In fact, higher cognitive ability can sometimes make procrastination easier. A clever brain is good at rationalizing delay, at coming up with reasons why now isn't the right time, at believing it can compensate later, and sometimes it can. Which reinforces the habit. When someone manages to complete tasks successfully at the last minute, the brain learns that waiting is safe. That pressure can be motivating, that there's no real cost. The stress is unpleasant, but the outcome is acceptable. Over time, this teaches the brain that procrastination works, at least well enough. The problem is that this strategy becomes brittle. It relies on adrenaline and urgency. It leaves little room for error. And it accumulates stress quietly, even when the person appears to be functioning. So if procrastination isn't laziness, ignorance, or simple poor planning, what is it? It's a mismatch between how the brain evolved to manage effort and how modern tasks demand it. It's a coping mechanism for emotional discomfort tied to work. It's a habit reinforced by short-term relief and distorted time perception, and it's a behaviour shaped by context, not character. Seeing procrastination this way doesn't excuse it in the sense of removing responsibility. Tasks still need to be done, consequences still exist. But it does remove unnecessary shame, and shame, as it turns out, is one of the strongest fuels for procrastination there is. When people feel ashamed of procrastinating, they avoid the task even more, because the task becomes associated not just with effort, but with self-criticism. The emotional load increases. Avoidance becomes more appealing. The cycle tightens. Understanding what procrastination actually is allows us to interrupt that cycle, not by demanding more discipline, but by reducing the emotional barriers to starting, by changing how tasks are framed, how environments are structured, and how expectations are managed. We're not there yet. For now, it's enough to recognize that procrastination is a signal, not a verdict. It's information about how a task is being perceived by the brain. information about effort, emotion, and timing. And once you start listening to that signal, rather than fighting it or labeling yourself with it, you begin to notice patterns. Which tasks trigger it? Which feelings precede it? Which moments make delay almost inevitable? Those patterns are where understanding deepens. And from there, without any dramatic turning points or sudden resolutions, the story continues forward, step by step, into how the brain weighs comfort against progress, often without asking permission first. When people say they want to change their habits, what they often mean is that they want their brains to start valuing long-term progress more than short-term comfort. They want effort to feel easier, resistance to feel quieter, and starting to feel natural rather than heavy. But that desire runs directly into one of the brain's most consistent preferences. Given a choice between what feels comfortable now and what will matter later, the brain almost always leans toward comfort. This isn't a flaw in design. It is the design. To understand why procrastination feels so persuasive, we have to look at what the brain is actually optimized to do. The human brain did not evolve to complete abstract projects with delayed rewards. It evolved to keep a living organism alive in uncertain environments, and in that context, comfort is not indulgence. Comfort is safety. Comfort means low energy expenditure, low threat, and predictability. Progress, on the other hand, often means uncertainty, effort, and risk. From the brain's perspective, effort is not morally neutral. It has a cost. Every mentally demanding task increases energy consumption. Every moment of sustained focus requires resources that could otherwise be conserved. The brain, despite representing only a small fraction of body weight, uses a disproportionate amount of the body's energy. As a result, it has developed powerful mechanisms to avoid unnecessary expenditure. This is why the brain is constantly asking a quiet question beneath conscious awareness. Is this worth it right now? When a task promises immediate, tangible reward, the answer is often yes. When the reward is distant, abstract, or uncertain, the answer becomes less clear. And when the task also carries emotional discomfort, boredom, or the possibility of failure, the answer tilts heavily toward no. Progress, especially the kind demanded by modern life, is usually invisible at the beginning. Writing the first paragraph of a report does not feel like progress toward a finished product. Studying the first page of material does not feel like mastery. Cleaning one small corner of a cluttered space does not feel like order. The payoff is delayed and cumulative. The discomfort is immediate. Comfort, by contrast, offers instant feedback. It reduces tension. It replaces effort with ease. It requires no sustained attention. And the brain is exquisitely sensitive to these differences. This sensitivity is shaped by the brain's reward system, which evolved to reinforce behaviors that improve survival prospects. When you eat, rest, socialize, or avoid danger, your brain releases neurotransmitters that signal safety and satisfaction. These signals are not subtle. They are powerful enough to shape behavior through repetition, often without conscious awareness. Progress-oriented tasks rarely trigger the same immediate response. The reward comes later, sometimes much later, and when rewards are delayed, the brain discounts them. This is not a character issue, it's a well-documented phenomenon known as temporal discounting. The further away a reward is in time, the less weight the brain gives it when making decisions. That discounting doesn't happen evenly. Immediate discomfort is weighted heavily. Future benefits are weighted lightly. So when faced with a choice between working now for a benefit, you'll feel weeks from now, or avoiding the work and feeling better immediately, the brain's math favours avoidance. What makes this even more influential is that comfort doesn't just feel good, it feels right. When you choose the comfortable option, the brain interprets that choice as aligned with its primary goal, maintaining equilibrium, reducing stress, keeping energy expenditure manageable, avoiding unnecessary strain. Progress often disrupts that equilibrium. It requires sustained effort without immediate reassurance. It introduces uncertainty. It forces confrontation with limits, mistakes, or incomplete understanding. From a biological point of view, those are not attractive conditions. This is why procrastination often intensifies when people are already tired, stressed, or overwhelmed. When energy reserves are low, the brain becomes even more conservative. It narrows focus. It prioritizes restoration over expansion. Comfort becomes not just preferable, but urgent. This doesn't mean the brain is incapable of pursuing long-term goals. Clearly, humans do that all the time, but it does mean that long-term goals are pursued only when certain conditions are met. When the effort feels manageable, when the path forward is clear, when emotional resistance is low enough not to trigger avoidance. When those conditions aren't present, the brain doesn't simply power through. It looks for relief. That relief can take many forms: checking a phone, tidying something irrelevant, watching something familiar, planning instead of doing. These behaviors are not random. They share a common feature. They reduce cognitive and emotional strain without demanding much in return. The brain experiences this reduction as a win. Even if the win is small and temporary, it is immediate. And immediacy matters more to the brain than optimal outcomes in the distant future. This is one reason why advice that focuses purely on willpower tends to fail. Willpower is not a separate mental muscle that can override biology indefinitely. It is a fragile, context-dependent capacity that depends heavily on energy levels, emotional state, and environmental cues. When people rely on willpower alone to force progress, they are asking the brain to act against its strongest incentives. Sometimes that works, often it doesn't. And when it fails, people tend to blame themselves rather than the mismatch between the demand and the system responding to it. Another layer to this preference for comfort is predictability. The brain values what it can anticipate. Familiar activities, even if they are not particularly rewarding, feel safer than unfamiliar ones. This is why people often procrastinate by doing things they've done many times before. Tasks that are easy, known, and low risk. Progress-oriented tasks are often unfamiliar, especially at the beginning. They involve uncertainty about how long they will take, how difficult they will be, and how well they will turn out. That uncertainty is stressful, and the brain treats stress as a signal to be cautious. So when someone avoids starting a project, it's not because they don't want the outcome. It's because starting exposes them to uncertainty without immediate payoff. Waiting keeps the uncertainty at bay for a little longer. There is also an emotional dimension that makes comfort especially compelling. Many tasks that people procrastinate on are not just effortful, but emotionally loaded. They may involve evaluation by others, the possibility of criticism, the risk of confirming a fear about one's abilities, the discomfort of confronting something unfinished or imperfect. Comfort shields against these feelings. It creates a buffer, and that buffer can feel essential, especially for people who are sensitive to self-criticism or who tie performance closely to self-worth. This is why progress can feel threatening even when it's desired. Progress means exposure. It means engaging with the task in a way that makes outcomes more real. Comfort keeps things hypothetical. The brain, faced with that choice, often opts for what keeps emotional intensity lower, not because it wants to sabotage success, but because it is trying to regulate internal state. Over time, this preference becomes reinforced through habit. Each time comfort is chosen and nothing catastrophic happens, the brain learns that avoidance is safe. Each time progress is delayed and eventually completed under pressure, the brain learns that waiting works. These lessons accumulate quietly. Eventually, the brain doesn't evaluate each situation from scratch. It relies on learned patterns. If similar tasks have been avoided before, avoidance becomes the default response. Comfort is chosen automatically, without conscious deliberation. This is why procrastination can feel so frustrating. People often understand logically that progress would reduce stress in the long run. They can see the pattern, they can predict the consequences, but logic operates at a slower, more reflective level of cognition. Comfort-seeking operates quickly, emotionally, and habitually. When the two conflict, comfort usually wins. Understanding this does not mean resigning yourself to it, but it does mean recognizing that progress will never feel as immediately attractive as comfort. Any strategy that assumes otherwise is likely to disappoint. What actually shifts behavior is not trying to make progress feel better than comfort, but making progress feel less threatening, reducing the emotional and cognitive barriers that trigger avoidance, adjusting tasks so that starting does not demand a full commitment or a perfect outcome. The brain is far more willing to engage when effort is bounded, expectations are clear, and discomfort is limited. It responds well to defined beginnings, short durations, and visible feedback. It struggles with vague goals, open-ended demands, and unclear endpoints. This is why small starts are powerful, not because they magically create motivation, but because they reduce perceived cost. A task that feels like work on this for 10 minutes is less threatening than one that feels like finish this. The brain can tolerate short-term effort when the end is visible. It's also why environment matters so much. When comfort is easily accessible and progress requires friction, procrastination becomes almost inevitable. When progress is made easier and comfort requires effort, behavior shifts without force. None of this requires moral judgment. The brain's preference for comfort is not something to overcome through discipline alone. It's something to account for, to work with, to design around. Progress happens not when comfort is eliminated, but when the gap between comfort and effort is narrowed enough that starting feels tolerable. When the brain no longer interprets the task as a threat to equilibrium. As we move forward, the focus won't be on fighting this preference, but on understanding how it shapes everyday decisions, how it influences motivation, planning, and follow-through, and how small changes in perception and structure can redirect it gently without demanding a complete overhaul of how the brain works. Because comfort isn't the enemy, it's a signal. And learning how that signal interacts with effort is one of the keys to understanding why waiting feels so natural, even when you know exactly where you'd like to go next. There is a quiet assumption built into many conversations about procrastination, an assumption so common that it often goes unnoticed. It's the idea that when you put something off, you're choosing it against your own best interests, that you are, in some sense, acting irrationally, hurting yourself for no good reason. And yet, when you look more closely at how the mind actually represents the self across time, that assumption begins to weaken. Because the person who will deal with the consequences of today's delay does not feel like you, not really. When you think about tomorrow, next week, or next month, you can describe what you expect will happen. You can picture events. You can imagine outcomes. But the emotional connection to that future version of yourself is surprisingly thin. From the brain's perspective, future you is not fully you yet. Future you is an idea, a projection, a character with fewer emotional details than the person sitting here right now. This is not a failure of imagination. It's a feature of how the brain organizes identity. Neuroscience research shows that when people think about their present selves, certain brain regions associated with emotion, valuation, and personal relevance become highly active. These regions help determine what feels important, urgent, or meaningful. When people think about their future selves, those same regions are often less engaged. Instead, the brain treats future self-representations more like representations of other people. In practical terms, this means the brain does not fully experience future consequences as personal consequences. They are abstract, muted, less emotionally charged, and because emotional weight is a major driver of decision-making, this distance matters more than logic alone. When you decide to delay a task, the discomfort you are avoiding belongs to present you. The stress you are creating belongs to future you. The brain weighs those two experiences very differently. Present discomfort feels vivid and real, Future discomfort feels hypothetical and manageable, even if past experience suggests otherwise. This temporal distance helps explain why promises made to yourself are so easy to break. When you say, "I'll do it tomorrow," the commitment is directed at someone else, someone who feels more capable, more rested, more motivated, someone who, from this moment, does not feel burdened. That version of you has infinite potential, no fatigue, no distractions, no competing demands. And because that version is imaginary, the brain assumes it can handle things better than you can right now. This illusion is powerful. It allows delay to feel reasonable rather than reckless. It reframes procrastination as delegation. You're not avoiding the task, you're assigning it to someone who will be better equipped. The problem, of course, is that tomorrow arrives, and when it does, you are still you. The same brain, the same energy constraints, the same emotional responses. The only thing that has changed is the level of urgency. At that point, the brain often switches strategies. Instead of relying on comfort, it relies on pressure, adrenaline, fear of consequences. This can produce action, but it is not the same as motivation. It is a stress response. And because this cycle sometimes works, tasks get done, deadlines are met, disasters are narrowly avoided, the brain learns a dangerous lesson. It learns that waiting is not only tolerable, but efficient. Why expend effort early when urgency can do the work later? This reinforces the feeling that future you is different, stronger, more capable, better under pressure. And so the cycle continues. What makes this even more complicated is that memory plays a role in maintaining the illusion. When people look back on past procrastination episodes, they often remember the relief of finishing, not the cost of the stress that preceded it. The exhaustion fades, the anxiety becomes vague, the success stands out. The brain uses this distorted memory to predict future outcomes. It says, "You've handled this before, you'll handle it again." And technically that may be true, but it ignores the cumulative toll of repeated stress, reduced sleep, and constant self-criticism. The distance between present and future self also affects how people respond to rewards. Immediate rewards are easy to value because they are experienced directly. Delayed rewards require imagination. They depend on the brain's ability to simulate future pleasure with enough intensity to matter now. For many tasks, that simulation is weak. Finishing a report next week does not produce a vivid emotional image. Neither does improved long-term health or reduce stress months from now. These benefits are real, but they are emotionally quiet. Comfort now, by contrast, is loud. It is felt in the body. It produces immediate changes in mood and tension. The brain responds to that difference instinctively. This is why even people with strong long-term goals still procrastinate. The problem is not a lack of values, it's a lack of emotional continuity across time. Interestingly, this continuity varies between individuals and situations. Some people feel more connected to their future selves than others. They can imagine future consequences more vividly. They experience delayed outcomes as more personal. These people tend to save more money, engage in healthier behaviours, and procrastinate less. But this is not a moral advantage. It is a difference in cognitive representation. A difference in how the brain links present actions to future identity. Stress, fatigue, and emotional overload weaken this link. When the brain is taxed, it narrows its focus. The future fades, the present dominates. Under these conditions, future self becomes even more abstract, even less compelling. This helps explain why procrastination often worsens during periods of burnout or emotional strain. It's not that people stop caring about their future, it's that their brains stop prioritizing it. Another factor that increases distance from future self is uncertainty. The less predictable the future feels, the harder it is to care about it. When outcomes are unclear or unstable, the brain hesitates to invest effort. It focuses on managing what it can control right now. In uncertain environments, this strategy makes sense. Conserving resources and responding to immediate conditions is adaptive. The problem arises when this ancient strategy is applied to modern tasks that require delayed gratification and sustained effort. The brain does not automatically update its priorities just because the environment has changed. It continues to treat the future with caution and the present with urgency. There is also a subtle identity issue involved. People often think of themselves as consistent over time, but in reality, identity is fluid. Moods change, energy levels fluctuate, priorities shift. The brain tracks these changes and adjusts expectations accordingly. When you imagine future you imagine a stable version, someone who will feel one way about the task. But when that future arrives, internal conditions may not match the image. The disconnect creates frustration and self-blame, further weakening trust between present and future self. Over time, this can erode self-confidence. If promises to yourself are repeatedly broken, you may stop believing in future commitments altogether. You may begin to see procrastination as inevitable, part of who you are, rather than a predictable outcome of how the brain manages time and emotion. This belief can become self-reinforcing. If you expect future you to fail, you may unconsciously lower your investment now. Why try if you don't trust the outcome? What's often missing from this picture is compassion for the present self. Present you is the one doing the emotional labor, feeling the resistance, managing the discomfort, carrying the uncertainty. Future, you does not feel any of that yet. When advice tells you to think about your future, it often assumes that imagining consequences will automatically motivate action. But without emotional connection, imagination alone is weak. It does not counterbalance immediate discomfort. Bridging the gap between present and future self requires more than reminders. It requires making future outcomes feel tangible, making progress visible, reducing the emotional cost of starting so that the present self does not feel abandoned in favor of an abstract ideal. It also requires acknowledging that future you is not a savior. Future you is simply present you, later, with similar constraints, similar tendencies, similar needs. When this realization settles in, something shifts. Delay stops feeling like a clever workaround and starts feeling like a transfer of stress from one moment to another, from one version of you to the same version, slightly older, slightly more tired. This awareness does not instantly eliminate procrastination, but it changes the internal dialogue. Instead of assuming future you will handle it, you begin to see the continuity, the shared responsibility, the shared cost. And with that shift, the question subtly changes. It moves away from, why can't I make myself do this? And toward, how can I make this easier for the person who has to live with it, including me right now? That question opens space for practical adjustments rather than self-judgment. It invites strategies that reduce friction, increase clarity, and acknowledge limits. Not to perfect productivity, but to reduce unnecessary strain. As we continue, this idea of temporal distance will keep resurfacing. Because procrastination is not just about tasks, it's about how the mind stretches identity across time, and how easily that stretch becomes a gap that comfort fills quietly, one delay at a time, until urgency pulls everything back together again. When people hear the word dopamine, it's often described as the brain's pleasure chemical. That description is simple, catchy, and mostly wrong. Dopamine is not about pleasure in the way most people imagine it. It's not released because something feels good. It's released because something feels worth pursuing right now. And that distinction matters a great deal when trying to understand why immediate rewards so often overpower long-term intentions. Dopamine is best understood as a signal of motivation and salience. It tells the brain, this matters, pay attention, move toward this. It helps decide what rises to the top of awareness and what fades into the background. In an environment full of competing options, dopamine acts like a spotlight, illuminating whatever promises the quickest, clearest payoff. That spotlight is not evenly distributed. Tasks associated with delayed abstract rewards tend to receive very little dopamine activity at the beginning. There is no clear signal that says, "This will feel good later." The brain does not experience future satisfaction in advance. It experiences only the present cost, effort, uncertainty, boredom, emotional friction. Immediate rewards, by contrast, produce a fast and predictable dopamine response. You check something new, you receive information, you get a notification, you experience novelty. The brain registers this as a meaningful event, even if it has no lasting value. The reward is small, but the signal is clear. This difference in signaling is one of the central reasons procrastination feels so compelling. When the brain is choosing between a task that promises a distant, uncertain benefit and an activity that offers immediate feedback, dopamine biases the decision before conscious reasoning has much chance to intervene. What's important here is that dopamine responds more strongly to anticipation than to satisfaction itself. The brain releases dopamine not just when you receive a reward, but when you expect one. This is why checking for updates, messages, or new content can become so habit-forming. The anticipation of something new produces repeated dopamine spikes, even if the content itself is mediocre. Long-term goals struggle in this environment because they don't generate strong anticipatory signals. Writing a paper, exercising for long-term health, or organizing finances rarely produce a clear, reward-incoming message at the outset. The brain does not light up in the same way. Instead, it registers cost without compensation. This imbalance makes immediate rewards disproportionately attractive, especially when the brain is already under strain. Stress, fatigue, and emotional overload all increase sensitivity to quick dopamine hits. Under these conditions, the brain becomes more reactive. It looks for fast regulation, not long-term optimization. This is why procrastination often worsens when people are tired. When energy is low, the brain's ability to tolerate delayed rewards decreases. The dopamine system shifts toward whatever can restore a sense of engagement or relief quickly. The modern environment amplifies this tendency dramatically. For most of human history, immediate rewards were limited. Food required effort. Social interaction required presence. Novelty was rare. Today, immediate rewards are abundant, cheap, and engineered to be maximally engaging. Every device offers an endless stream of small, unpredictable rewards, which is exactly the pattern the dopamine system is most sensitive to. Unpredictability matters here. When rewards are inconsistent, arriving sometimes but not always, dopamine activity increases. The brain becomes more attentive, more curious, more engaged. This is the same mechanism behind gambling behavior, and it applies just as effectively to scrolling, refreshing, and checking. Procrastination often takes this form not because people are consciously choosing distraction, but because their dopamine systems are being pulled toward activities that promise quick engagement. The brain is not weighing values, it is responding to signals. This also explains why people often procrastinate by doing things that feel productive but are not actually important. Cleaning, organizing, researching excessively, planning endlessly. These activities offer a sense of progress without the emotional risk of the core task. They generate small dopamine rewards because they feel like movement, even if they avoid the central challenge. Dopamine does not distinguish between meaningful progress and superficial activity. It responds to perceived momentum. This can create the illusion of productivity while the most important work remains untouched. Another key feature of dopamine is that it habituates quickly. The same reward produces less dopamine over time unless something changes. This drives novelty-seeking behavior. The brain wants something new, something different, something that reactivates the signal. Long-term tasks rarely provide novelty at the beginning. They often feel repetitive, unclear, or slow. Immediate distractions, on the other hand, constantly refresh themselves. New posts, new messages, new information. The dopamine system favours these patterns naturally. This doesn't mean dopamine is working against you. It means dopamine evolved for environments where quick detection of opportunity mattered for survival. In that context, prioritising immediate signals made sense. In modern environments, the same system is overwhelmed. Another misconception is that increasing dopamine will automatically increase motivation for long-term tasks. People sometimes interpret this to mean they need to feel more inspired, more excited, more driven before starting. But waiting for dopamine to appear before acting often guarantees delay. Dopamine is not just a cause of action, it is also a consequence of action. When you begin a task, even imperfectly, dopamine can increase in response to progress, clarity, and feedback. But that increase usually comes after engagement, not before. This creates a paradox. You don't feel motivated because you haven't started, and you haven't started because you don't feel motivated. The brain waits for a signal that will never arrive unless something changes in the structure of the task or the environment. Immediate rewards break this stalemate because they do not require effort to access. They deliver dopamine without asking for commitment. The brain learns this pattern quickly. When effort is optional, avoidance becomes efficient. There is also an emotional layer to how dopamine interacts with procrastination. Tasks associated with negative emotions suppress dopamine release. Anxiety, fear of failure, resentment, and self-doubt all reduce the brain's expectation of reward. When a task feels emotionally loaded, the dopamine system does not signal approach. It signals caution. This makes immediate rewards even more appealing by contrast. They offer not just engagement, but escape from negative emotional states. The relief is subtle, but real. Over time, this dynamic can shift baseline motivation. If most dopamine activity is tied to quick, low-effort rewards, sustained tasks begin to feel increasingly unrewarding. The brain adapts to the faster pace of stimulation and becomes less responsive to slower forms of progress. This does not mean attention spans are permanently damaged. It means the brain adapts to what it is repeatedly exposed to. Change the pattern, and the system recalibrates. But that recalibration requires intention and structure, not just insight. One of the most important implications of this is that procrastination is not simply about resisting temptation. It is about competing reward systems. When immediate rewards are plentiful and long-term rewards are abstract, the outcome is predictable. This also explains why reducing distractions often helps more than increasing motivation. When immediate rewards are removed or made less accessible, the dopamine system becomes more sensitive to subtler signals. Progress begins to register again. Effort starts to feel less empty. Similarly, when long-term tasks are redesigned to provide faster feedback, dopamine engagement increases. Visible progress, clear endpoints, and defined time limits all help the brain recognize effort as meaningful. Importantly, this does not require turning work into entertainment. It requires making cause and effect more immediate. When the brain can see a link between action and outcome, even a small one, dopamine has something to respond to. This is why starting is so powerful. The act of beginning reduces uncertainty. It clarifies the task. It transforms a vague threat into a concrete activity. Once that happens, dopamine activity can increase, not because the task is suddenly pleasurable, but because it is now actionable. The role of dopamine in procrastination also explains why punishment-based approaches often fail. Threatening yourself with consequences does not increase dopamine, it increases stress. And stress, while it can produce urgency, does not create sustainable motivation. Stress-driven action relies on adrenaline, not dopamine. It is effective in short bursts but costly over time. It reinforces the idea that work is something to survive rather than engage with. This further distances long-term goals from positive reward signals. Understanding dopamine reframes procrastination in a critical way. The problem is not that people are choosing the wrong thing. The problem is that the brain is responding exactly as it was designed to respond in an environment flooded with immediate stimuli. The solution, such as it is, does not involve suppressing dopamine or trying to eliminate comfort. It involves shaping reward timing, making progress visible sooner, reducing the intensity and availability of competing rewards, creating conditions where effort produces feedback quickly enough to matter. This is not about discipline in the moral sense. It is about aligning incentives with biology. As this becomes clearer, another misconception begins to fade. The idea that procrastination happens because people do not want to work. In reality, procrastination often happens because the brain does not see working as rewarding in the moment. Change that perception, even slightly, and behavior shifts. The next layer to explore is how emotion interacts with this reward system. Because dopamine does not operate in isolation. It is influenced heavily by fear, self-judgment, and uncertainty. Immediate rewards do not just compete with long-term goals. They often serve as emotional regulators, dampening feelings the brain wants to avoid. That interaction between emotion, reward, and avoidance adds another dimension to why waiting feels so natural, even when the cost is obvious. And it leads directly into the deeper emotional drivers that sit beneath procrastination, quietly shaping what the brain decides is worth doing right now. When people describe procrastination in casual conversation, the word laziness comes up quickly. It's a simple explanation, almost comforting in its bluntness. If delay is caused by laziness, then the solution seems straightforward. Try harder, care more, push through. And yet, this explanation rarely holds up when you look closely at how procrastination actually feels from the inside. Because procrastination does not feel like apathy. It feels tense. It feels restless. It feels like wanting to move forward and being unable to. It feels like carrying a task around mentally while never quite touching it. That emotional texture alone tells us something important. Procrastination is not the absence of motivation. It is the presence of something else. That something else is fear. Not always the dramatic kind. Not the kind that makes your heart race or your palms sweat. More often, it's quiet, subtle, and easy to miss. It hides behind rational thoughts, practical concerns, and perfectly reasonable explanations. But at its core, procrastination is very often an attempt to avoid an emotional threat. The brain is highly sensitive to threat, even when the threat is symbolic rather than physical. Social judgment, failure, loss of control, disappointment, and shame all activate neural systems designed to protect us. These systems evolved to keep us safe in social groups where mistakes could have serious consequences. Being rejected, criticized, or exposed as incompetent once carried real survival costs. Modern tasks still trigger these ancient systems. When a task is tied to evaluation, comparison, or performance, the brain does not treat it as neutral work. It treats it as a potential threat to identity. A report is not just a report. It is evidence of intelligence. A presentation is not just information. It is visibility. A creative project is not just output. It is a reflection of self. Fear enters quietly at this point. Not fear of the task itself, but fear of what the task might reveal. Fear of doing it badly. Fear of confirming doubts you already have about yourself. Fear of wasting effort on something that might not matter. Fear of discovering that you are not as capable as you hope. These fears rarely announce themselves clearly. Instead, they show up as resistance, as distraction, as a sense that now is not the right time. The brain does not say, "I am afraid." It says, "Let's do this later." Avoidance reduces fear in the short term. When you don't engage with the task, you don't have to face the possibility of failure. You don't have to confront uncertainty. You don't have to sit with the discomfort of not knowing how it will turn out. That reduction in emotional intensity is immediate, and the brain registers it as relief. This is why procrastination persists even when it creates long-term stress. The brain is not optimizing for long-term well-being. It is optimizing for emotional safety in the present moment. And safety, from the brain's perspective, often means not exposing yourself to judgment or uncertainty right now. Another common fear that drives procrastination is fear of starting without clarity. Many tasks do not have a clear first step. They are vague, open-ended, poorly defined. When the brain cannot predict what will happen next, it becomes cautious. Uncertainty is stressful. The brain prefers known discomfort to unknown outcomes. Starting a task without knowing exactly how to proceed creates a sense of cognitive instability. Avoidance restores a feeling of control, even if that control is illusory. This is why people often procrastinate by preparing endlessly, researching more, organizing materials, making plans. These activities create the feeling of readiness without requiring exposure, the risk of action. They feel safer than committing to a direction that might turn out to be wrong. There is also fear of effort itself, not because effort is painful, but because effort consumes resources. When people are already emotionally or mentally exhausted, the brain becomes protective. It lowers tolerance for strain. It becomes less willing to engage with anything that might require sustained attention or resilience. In this state, even small tasks can feel overwhelming, not because they are objectively difficult, but because the system responsible for managing stress is already overloaded. Procrastination becomes a way of conserving what little capacity remains. This helps explain why procrastination often spikes during periods of burnout, grief, illness, or chronic stress. It is not a sign of weakness, it is a sign that the system is under strain and trying to avoid additional load. Fear also shows up in a more paradoxical form: fear of success. This sounds counterintuitive, but it is surprisingly common. Success can bring increased expectations, visibility, responsibility, or change. For some people, completing a task does not just end it. It opens the door to more demands. If finishing one project leads to more work, more scrutiny, or higher standards, the brain may associate progress with loss of autonomy or safety. Delay becomes a way of maintaining the status quo. This is rarely conscious. People do not think, "I'm afraid of succeeding." Instead, they feel inexplicable resistance, a sense that moving forward will cost something they are not ready to give up. Fear of commitment can operate in a similar way. Starting a task can feel like locking yourself into a path. Once you begin, it becomes harder to change direction. Avoiding the start keeps options open. It preserves flexibility. The brain values this, especially when outcomes are uncertain. There is also fear rooted in self-image. Many people carry internal narratives about who they are and what they are capable of. Tasks that challenge these narratives create tension. If you see yourself as competent, a difficult task threatens that identity. If you see yourself as struggling, success threatens that identity as well. In both cases, delay protects the story. As long as the task remains unfinished, the narrative remains intact. You're neither proven capable nor incapable. You remain in a state of potential. Potential feels safer than evidence. This is why procrastination often involves a strange mixture of hope and avoidance. You hope the future will somehow resolve the task, or that you will feel different later. That hope cushions the fear enough to justify waiting. Laziness, in contrast, does not require justification. A lazy person does not feel compelled to explain delay. Procrastination almost always does. People who procrastinate think about the task constantly. They make mental bargains. They rehearse explanations. They feel guilt. These are not the hallmarks of indifference. They are the hallmarks of internal conflict. Another emotional driver worth naming is shame. Shame is a powerful inhibitor of action. When people associate tasks with self-criticism, they avoid not just the work, but the feelings that come with it. Each delay then adds another layer of shame, making the task even heavier. This creates a feedback loop. Delay increases shame. Shame increases avoidance. Avoidance increases delay. Over time, the task becomes emotionally charged far beyond its original difficulty. At that point, starting feels overwhelming not because of the work itself, but because of everything attached to it emotionally. The brain treats the task as a source of pain and does what it does best when pain is anticipated. It pulls away. Understanding procrastination as fear-driven changes how we think about solutions. If procrastination were laziness, the solution would be pressure, discipline, force. But fear does not respond well to force. Pressure amplifies threat. It raises stakes. It increases self-monitoring. For some people, this produces short bursts of action, but it often strengthens the underlying fear, making future avoidance more likely. What fear responds to is safety, clarity, manageability, reduced stakes. When tasks feel less threatening, resistance decreases naturally. Not because you have become more disciplined, but because the brain no longer feels the need to protect you from them. This does not mean fear disappears. It means it no longer dominates decision-making. One of the most effective ways to reduce fear-driven procrastination is to change the meaning of starting. When starting is framed as a test, fear spikes. When starting is framed as exploration, fear softens. When starting is framed as irreversible commitment, avoidance grows. When starting is framed as a small, contained action, engagement becomes possible. The brain does not need certainty to act. It needs tolerable risk. Recognizing fear in procrastination also invites compassion, not the kind that excuses all behavior, but the kind that acknowledges what the system is responding to. When you see delay as fear rather than failure, the internal dialogue shifts. Curiosity replaces judgment. Observation replaces blame. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with me?" the question becomes, "What feels threatening about this right now?" That question is far more useful. It directs attention to emotional barriers rather than imagined character flaws. As this understanding deepens, procrastination stops being a personal mystery and starts to look like a predictable response to certain emotional conditions. Conditions that can be adjusted, softened, or worked around. Fear may sit at the core of delay, but it does not have to dictate behavior forever. It is a signal, not a command. And learning how that signal interacts with reward, comfort, and time is what allows the pattern to loosen, gradually, without force. From here, the story continues into how perfectionism and expectations amplify fear, and how the search for the right moment often keeps action permanently out of reach, even when everything else seems ready. One of the most convincing stories procrastination tells is that it is simply waiting for better conditions. More time, more clarity, more energy, a quieter moment, a cleaner slate. On the surface, this sounds reasonable, sensible even. Why start something important when you're not fully prepared? Why risk doing it poorly when you could do it properly later? This is where perfectionism quietly enters the picture. Perfectionism is often misunderstood as caring too much about quality or having high standards. But at its core, perfectionism is not about excellence. It is about control. Specifically, control over outcomes, impressions, and self-image. And when control feels uncertain, perfectionism does not push people forward. It pulls them back. Perfectionism creates an illusion, the belief that there exists a right moment to begin, a moment when conditions will align, when motivation will feel natural, when doubt will be absent, when the task will unfold smoothly because you are finally ready. That moment feels very real, and it almost never arrives. The brain loves this illusion because it offers a socially acceptable reason to delay. You're not avoiding the task, you're being responsible, thoughtful, strategic. You're waiting until you can do it justice, until you can give it what it deserves. Underneath that reasoning, however, something else is happening. The brain is protecting itself from exposure. Perfectionism raises the emotional stakes of starting. When standards are high and outcomes feel personally significant, beginning a task becomes a moment of vulnerability. Once you start, your ability becomes visible. Your limitations become clearer. Mistakes become possible. The fantasy of flawless execution gives way to reality. As long as you don't start, that fantasy remains intact. This is why perfectionism often leads to delay rather than action. It makes the cost of an imperfect beginning feel higher than the cost of waiting. And because waiting does not immediately challenge self-image, it feels safer. The illusion of the right moment is reinforced by memory. People tend to remember times when conditions were favourable and work felt easier. Moments of flow, days when everything clicked. These memories create the impression that productivity depends on internal alignment rather than external structure. But those moments are rare not because something is wrong with you, but because they depend on many variables lining up at once. Energy, mood, environment, clarity, and momentum. Waiting for all of these to align before starting is like waiting for perfect weather before ever leaving the house. In practice, progress usually creates clarity, not the other way around. Energy follows engagement more often than it precedes it. Confidence grows through exposure, not preparation alone. But perfectionism reverses this order. It insists that readiness must come first. The brain uses this insistence to justify delay. It says, "Not now. You're not at your best. Do it later when you can really focus." This voice sounds protective, supportive even. But what it's really doing is preserving the comfort of potential. Potential is intoxicating. As long as something remains undone, it can still be imagined as perfect. The report could be brilliant. The project could be exceptional. The idea could be groundbreaking. Once you start, potential collapses into specifics, and specifics invite judgment. Perfectionism also distorts how people interpret difficulty. When a task feels hard at the beginning, perfectionism treats that difficulty as evidence of poor timing or inadequate readiness. It says, "See, this feels wrong, you should wait." In reality, most meaningful tasks feel hard at the beginning. Confusion, friction, and uncertainty are normal parts of starting, but perfectionism frames these sensations as warning signs rather than expected features. It misreads discomfort as failure. This misinterpretation creates a loop. You wait for the task to feel easier. It doesn't, because ease often comes after engagement. The continued discomfort confirms that the moment is still not right. Delay continues. Another way perfectionism sustains procrastination is by inflating the definition of starting. For someone without perfectionistic tendencies, starting might mean opening a document or sketching a rough outline. For a perfectionist, starting often feels like committing to the final version. This makes beginning feel heavy. It feels irreversible. Once you start, you're no longer in planning mode. You're on record. That sense of finality increases fear and avoidance. Perfectionism also thrives on comparison. When people measure their early efforts against polished outcomes, their own work feels inadequate by default. This comparison discourages starting because it guarantees disappointment. What often goes unnoticed is that perfectionism does not demand perfection from others in the same way. It is highly selective. It targets the self. It links performance directly to worth. This is why procrastination driven by perfectionism feels emotionally intense. It's not just about getting something done. It's about protecting identity, avoiding evidence that might contradict how you want to see yourself or how you want to be seen. The illusion of the right moment also benefits from modern work culture. Many environments reward polished output without acknowledging the messy process behind it. Finished products are visible, drafts are not. This reinforces the belief that work should appear smooth and effortless. When people internalize this belief, they assume that struggle indicates incompetence, so they wait. They wait until they believe the struggle will disappear. but struggle is part of the process, not a sign that something has gone wrong. Perfectionism also interacts with fear of wasted effort. Starting something and doing it poorly can feel like squandering time. The brain prefers to believe that effort should always produce a high-quality result. If that cannot be guaranteed, avoidance seems rational. This is especially true for people who have experienced success in the past. When you are used to performing well, the possibility of average or mediocre output feels threatening. Perfectionism then acts as a defense against regression. The problem is that waiting does not preserve ability. Skills sharpen through use, not protection. And the longer a task is delayed, the more emotional weight it accumulates. Expectations rise, pressure builds, the imagined standard becomes even harder to meet. At that point, the right moment feels even further away. Another subtle aspect of perfectionism is its relationship with control over time. Waiting creates the illusion of agency. You're choosing not to act yet. You are in charge. Starting, by contrast, feels like surrendering control to the process and its uncertainties. The brain prefers the feeling of control even if it is illusory. Delay maintains that feeling. It keeps the future open and uncommitted. This is why deadlines often break perfectionistic procrastination. Not because they increase motivation, but because they remove the illusion of choice. When time runs out, the right moment becomes irrelevant, action becomes necessary. But relying on deadlines as the only trigger for action is costly. It ties productivity to stress. It trains the brain to associate work with pressure rather than engagement. Over time, this increases avoidance rather than reducing it. What dismantles the illusion of the right moment is not lowering standards, but redefining what starting means. Starting does not have to mean doing it well. It does not have to mean finishing. It does not even have to mean committing. Starting can mean gathering imperfect information, creating a rough, temporary version, exploring without evaluating, treating the first step as disposable. When starting is framed this way, perfectionism loses leverage. There is nothing to protect yet, nothing to judge. The brain feels less exposed. Another important shift involves separating identity from output. When work is treated as evidence of worth, perfectionism thrives. When work is treated as an experiment, a process, or a skill in progress, fear decreases. This is not a mindset shift achieved through affirmation. It is reinforced through experience, through repeated exposure to starting imperfectly and surviving the outcome, through learning that mistakes are informative rather than catastrophic. The illusion of the right moment fades when the brain learns that no amount of waiting produces certainty. Only action produces feedback. Only engagement produces clarity. And only imperfection produces progress. This does not mean rushing or abandoning care. It means recognizing that quality is built through iteration, not hesitation. That readiness is often the result of doing, not the prerequisite. Perfectionism promises safety through delay. In practice, it delivers stagnation and stress. Letting go of the illusion of the right moment is not about forcing yourself to act at all costs. It is about accepting that uncertainty is part of every meaningful beginning. As this acceptance grows, the grip of delay loosens, not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually as starting becomes less about proving something and more about discovering something. And from there, attention begins to shift toward another quiet contributor to procrastination. The exhaustion that comes from constant decision-making, the mental cost of choice itself, and how, when the brain is overloaded with options, waiting can feel like the only available response. There is a point in the day when even simple decisions begin to feel heavy. Choosing what to eat, deciding which email to answer first, figuring out where to start on a task you've already postponed several times. Nothing dramatic has happened, yet everything feels hard to initiate. This is not a failure of motivation or a sudden drop in discipline. It is the predictable result of a tired decision-making system. the brain makes decisions constantly. Many of them are so small and automatic that we barely notice them. Where to direct attention, whether to respond or ignore, how much effort to apply. Each choice carries a cost. Not a visible one, but a cognitive one. Over time, those costs accumulate. Decision fatigue refers to the gradual depletion of mental resources involved in making choices. As these resources diminish, the brain becomes less capable of thoughtful, effortful decision-making. It shifts toward defaults, toward habits, toward whatever requires the least additional effort. Procrastination fits neatly into this shift. When the brain is fresh, it can evaluate options, weigh long-term consequences, and tolerate short-term discomfort. When it is fatigued, it looks for relief. Not in the form of rest necessarily, but in the form of fewer demands, fewer choices, less internal negotiation. Avoiding a task accomplishes that instantly. To understand how decision fatigue feeds procrastination, it helps to look at how modern life structures choice. At almost every moment there are options competing for attention. Tasks to prioritize, messages to respond to, information to process. Even deciding what to ignore requires effort. The brain is rarely idle. This constant low-level decision-making taxes the same systems needed for self-regulation and planning. By the time you reach an important task, much of that capacity has already been spent on smaller, less meaningful choices. The task itself has not changed. Your ability to engage with it has. This is why procrastination often appears later in the day, not because the task is harder, but because the system responsible for initiating effort is depleted. Starting requires a decision, and decisions have become expensive. When faced with this cost, the brain looks for shortcuts. Habits become attractive because they bypass active choice. Familiar distractions, routine behaviors, and default actions step in. These are not necessarily pleasurable, they are simply easier. Procrastination often masquerades as indecision in these moments. You might feel unsure where to start, which approach to take, or how much time to commit. But beneath that uncertainty is a deeper reluctance to engage in yet another cognitively demanding choice. Choosing not to choose feels like relief. There is also a subtle emotional component to decision fatigue. As cognitive resources decline, tolerance for frustration decreases. Tasks that would normally feel manageable start to feel irritating or overwhelming. The brain becomes more reactive, less reflective. Under these conditions, long-term goals lose their pull. Immediate comfort becomes more compelling. The brain prioritizes emotional regulation over strategic thinking. Procrastination becomes a form of emotional triage. Another important aspect of decision fatigue is that it reduces sensitivity to future consequences. When mental energy is low, the brain narrows its time horizon. It focuses on what will make the next few minutes easier rather than what will improve the next few days. This narrowing is not a conscious choice, it is a protective response. Sustained planning requires resources the brain no longer has readily available, so it simplifies the problem by deferring it. The cost of too many choices is not limited to large decisions. Small, frequent choices are often more draining. Choosing between many low-stakes options consumes resources without delivering much reward. By the time a high-stakes task appears, the brain is already tired. This is why environments with excessive options can paradoxically reduce action. When everything is possible, starting anything becomes harder. The brain must evaluate more variables, more trade-offs, more potential outcomes. Each layer of choice adds friction. Tasks that lack clear structure amplify this effect. When a task does not specify where to begin, how long it will take, or what success looks like, the number of implicit decisions multiplies. How much time should I spend? What's the best approach? What if I choose the wrong one? For a fatigued brain, this is enough to trigger avoidance. Procrastination in these moments is not about unwillingness, it is about overload. The system cannot comfortably handle the number of decisions required to engage. so it opts out. This also explains why people often procrastinate by engaging in tasks that are already decided, scrolling through familiar content, reorganizing known spaces, repeating routine actions. These activities require little to no decision-making. They feel manageable when everything else feels demanding. The brain is not seeking pleasure so much as it is seeking simplicity. Another overlooked contributor to decision fatigue is self-monitoring. When people constantly evaluate their own performance, productivity, or emotional state, they add another layer of decision-making. Should I be doing this? Is this the best use of my time? Am I focused enough? This internal commentary consumes resources. It turns action into evaluation. Over time, the effort required to simply begin grows heavier. Perfectionism interacts strongly with this process. High standards increase the number of decisions involved in starting. Not only do you need to choose to begin, you also need to choose how well to do it, how thoroughly to prepare, and how to avoid mistakes. Each of these choices adds cognitive load. When that load becomes too great, avoidance becomes the path of least resistance. Decision fatigue also helps explain why rigid schedules sometimes fail. While structure can reduce decision-making, overly complex systems can do the opposite. When a schedule requires constant adjustment, prioritization, and optimization, it becomes another source of cognitive strain. The brain does not respond well to systems that demand frequent recalibration. It prefers stable routines and clear defaults. When systems are too flexible, they require too many choices. This is why simple rules often work better than detailed plans. Rules reduce the number of decisions required. They narrow options. They create automaticity. For example, a rule like, I work on this task for 10 minutes before checking anything else, removes the decision of how long to work. A rule like, I start with the most uncomfortable task, removes the decision of what to do first. The brain no longer has to negotiate. When these negotiations are removed, starting becomes easier. Decision fatigue also alters how people perceive effort. When resources are low, effort feels more costly than it actually is. Tasks appear larger, heavier, and more draining than they would under different conditions. This perception reinforces avoidance. The brain uses heuristics when tired. It relies on past experiences and emotional associations rather than careful analysis. If a task has been avoided before, it will likely be avoided again. The brain remembers the relief that followed avoidance, not the stress that accumulated later. This memory bias strengthens procrastination as a default response when decision-making capacity is low. Another important point is that decision fatigue does not disappear simply because a task is important. Importance can even make things worse. High-stakes tasks require more careful consideration, which demands more resources. When those resources are depleted, the brain feels trapped. This is why people sometimes procrastinate most on the tasks that matter most. The cost of making the wrong decision feels too high. Avoidance postpones that risk. Reducing procrastination driven by decision fatigue is less about increasing willpower and more about reducing the number of decisions required to act. This can be done in several ways, but the underlying principle is the same. Make action the default, make starting automatic, make choices smaller and fewer. This does not mean eliminating choice entirely. It means postponing non-essential decisions until after momentum has been established. Once engaged, the brain often regains capacity. Clarity improves. Decisions feel easier. This is why starting with a clearly defined, time-limited action is so effective. It bypasses the need for extensive planning. It gives the brain something concrete to do. The act of doing restores some of the resources that indecision drained. Another effective approach is pre-commitment. Making decisions in advance when the brain is fresh reduces the burden later. Deciding ahead of time when and where you will work removes the need to negotiate in the moment. Environmental design also plays a role. Reducing unnecessary options in the environment lowers cognitive load. Fewer distractions, Fewer tools open at once, fewer competing inputs. The brain performs better when the field of choice is narrow. It is also worth acknowledging that rest is not a luxury in this context. Genuine rest restores decision-making capacity, not passive distraction, but rest that reduces cognitive demand. Sleep, quiet, and unstructured time all play a role. When rest is neglected, decision fatigue becomes chronic. Procrastination becomes not an occasional response, but a persistent pattern. Understanding decision fatigue reframes procrastination yet again. It shows that delay is often the result of cumulative mental effort rather than a single moment of weakness. It highlights how modern environments strain cognitive systems that were never designed for constant choice. This perspective also explains why people can be highly disciplined in some areas and completely stalled in others. The distribution of decisions matters. Where resources are spent earlier in the day shapes what is possible later. As this pattern becomes clearer, it becomes easier to see procrastination not as a lack of effort, but as a signal of overload, a sign that too many decisions have already been made and the system is seeking relief. From here, the story naturally moves toward another subtle distortion that works alongside decision fatigue. How time itself feels unreal when deadlines are distant, and why tasks without immediate consequences fail to register as urgent, even when they matter deeply. One of the most puzzling aspects of procrastination is how sincerely we can intend to act later while feeling no urgency now. A deadline exists. We know it exists. We can name the date, sometimes even the hour, and yet, until a certain point, that deadline feels strangely unreal, distant, weightless, almost hypothetical. It sits on the calendar without exerting much pressure, as if it belongs to another version of time altogether. This disconnect is not a failure of intelligence or awareness. It comes from the way the human brain perceives time, and that perception is far less precise, far less linear than clocks and calendars would suggest. From the inside, time is not experienced as a continuous, evenly spaced flow. It is experienced as a series of moments shaped by attention, emotion, and relevance. The brain does not treat all future moments equally. It categorizes them broadly. There is now, which feels real and demanding. There is soon, which feels possible to engage with, and then there is later, which feels abstract and largely optional. Deadlines that fall into that later category do not trigger the same neural responses as immediate demands. They do not activate urgency. They do not command attention. They exist as information, not as pressure. This is why simply knowing a deadline exists is rarely enough to motivate action. Knowledge alone does not create urgency. Urgency emerges when time feels emotionally close, not when it is objectively near. The brain's time perception system evolved in environments where consequences were immediate and visible. If food was scarce, hunger was felt now. If danger approached, threat was present now. There was little need to represent abstract future consequences weeks or months in advance. Survival depended on responding to what was happening or about to happen. Modern deadlines ask the brain to do something it is not naturally good at. They ask it to treat distant, symbolic consequences as emotionally significant in the present moment. Most of the time, the brain does not comply. Instead, it compresses time. The future becomes flatter the further away it is. Differences between 3 days from now and 3 weeks from now feel minimal. Both are simply not now. This compression leads to a predictable pattern. Tasks with distant deadlines are easy to delay because they do not compete effectively with present moment demands. There is no felt cost to waiting. The brain assumes there will be time later without fully representing what that time will feel like when it arrives. Another important feature of time perception is that it is state-dependent. When people are relaxed, time feels expansive. There seems to be plenty of it. When people are stressed or under pressure, time feels scarce. It narrows. It accelerates. This means urgency is not a constant signal. It emerges under specific emotional conditions, and those conditions often do not appear until the deadline is close enough to feel threatening. Until that point, the brain treats the deadline as flexible, even when it is not. This also explains why people often underestimate how long tasks will take, especially when those tasks are delayed. The brain does not simulate future effort accurately. It imagines the task being done in an idealized state, with focus intact and interruptions minimal. That imagined version of time is efficient and smooth. Reality rarely matches that simulation. When the deadline finally approaches and the brain switches into urgency mode, time perception changes dramatically. Minutes feel shorter, hours feel compressed. The sense of having plenty of time disappears. The same task that felt manageable now feels overwhelming, not because it changed, but because the brain's representation of time did. This shift often surprises people, even though it happens repeatedly. They think, I didn't realize it would feel like this. But the brain simply did not register the future pressure earlier. It could not feel it until it became immediate. Another factor that makes deadlines feel unreal is their symbolic nature. A deadline is often just a date or number. It does not inherently contain sensory information. There is no physical signal associated with it. No sound, no movement, no direct sensation. The brain prioritizes information that is sensory and emotional. Abstract symbols require interpretation. They require mental effort to translate into something meaningful. As long as a deadline remains symbolic, it struggles to compete with concrete experiences. This is why deadlines often become real only when they are paired with consequences that are visible or emotionally charged. A reminder email, a message from another person, a sense of embarrassment or fear. These cues provide the emotional weight that the date itself lacks. Until then, the deadline exists more as an idea than as a force. Time perception is also influenced by memory. When people look back on previous deadlines, they often remember that things worked out in the end. They finished just in time. They managed. The stress fades faster than the relief. This creates a distorted memory of past time pressure. The brain uses these memories to predict future outcomes. It assumes that urgency will appear when needed, and that it will be sufficient. This reinforces delay. Why act now if pressure will take care of things later? The problem is that this strategy relies on stress as a trigger. It requires the brain to enter a high arousal state to initiate action. While this can work occasionally, it is costly. It depletes energy. It reduces quality. And it makes work feel aversive. Over time, the brain begins to associate tasks with stress rather than engagement. This increases avoidance earlier in the timeline, making deadlines feel even more distant and unreal. Another subtle distortion in time perception is optimism bias. People tend to believe they will have more time, energy, and motivation in the future than they do now. This belief is persistent, even when contradicted by experience. The brain imagines future time as more spacious because it is empty in imagination. It does not yet contain obligations, distractions, or fatigue. Present time, by contrast, is crowded. It is full of competing demands. This contrast makes it easy to believe that starting later is sensible. The brain assumes conditions will improve, even without evidence. This bias is reinforced by language. Phrases like, "I'll do it later," or "there's still time," suggest abundance. They frame time as a resource that can be accessed on demand. In reality, future time will be just as constrained as present time, if not more so. But the brain does not feel that constraint until it arrives. Time perception is also shaped by attention. When attention is absorbed elsewhere, time passes without notice. When attention is focused on waiting or anticipation, time slows down. Deadlines often fall into the first category until they become urgent. As long as attention is directed away from the task, time related to that task does not register. The deadline exists, but it is not attended to, and unattended information has little influence on behavior. This is why reminders can suddenly make a deadline feel real. They pull attention to the future consequence and anchor it in the present moment. Without attention, time remains abstract. Another reason deadlines feel unreal is that many tasks lack intermediate markers. If the only signal of progress is the final deadline, there is nothing to indicate how time should be used along the way. The brain struggles to allocate effort without feedback. In the absence of milestones, the deadline feels like a single distant event rather than a series of approaching moments. There is no sense of gradual escalation. Everything feels fine until it suddenly isn't. This all-or-nothing structure makes procrastination more likely. Without a felt sense of progression, there is little reason to act early. The brain waits for a clear signal. That signal arrives late. Time perception also interacts with emotion in important ways. When people feel anxious about a task, they may avoid thinking about it. This avoidance extends to avoiding thoughts about the deadline. The brain keeps the future vague as a form of emotional regulation. Thinking about the deadline increases discomfort, so the brain pushes it out of awareness. The deadline remains unreal until it can no longer be ignored. This avoidance does not require conscious effort. It happens automatically. The brain filters information that produces discomfort and prioritizes what feels manageable. Ironically, this makes the eventual confrontation with the deadline more intense, because it arrives suddenly, without gradual adjustment. The emotional spike is sharper. Understanding this pattern helps explain why people often say they lost track of time, or didn't realize how close it was. It is not always a factual error. It is often an emotional one. Time was not integrated into awareness because it was uncomfortable to hold. Another important point is that deadlines are external structures. They are imposed rather than felt. The brain responds more reliably to internal cues like hunger or fatigue than to external schedules. When deadlines are not internalized, they remain weak motivators. Internalizing a deadline requires making it emotionally relevant. That relevance does not come from importance alone. It comes from immediacy, clarity, and consequence. Without those elements, the deadline remains a number on a page. This is why self-imposed deadlines are often ignored. Without external enforcement or emotional weight, they feel optional. The brain treats them as suggestions rather than constraints. When external deadlines are enforced by real consequences, they eventually become real, but only at the point where those consequences feel imminent. This creates a cycle where procrastination persists until urgency appears, and urgency appears only when time feels scarce. The brain learns to rely on this cycle. It becomes the default way of working. Breaking this cycle requires changing how time is represented, not just how tasks are planned. It involves making future consequences feel closer, more concrete, and more emotionally salient earlier in the process. This does not mean increasing anxiety. Anxiety distorts time in unhelpful ways. It collapses perspective. What helps is clarity. Making time visible. Breaking distant deadlines into nearer points of engagement. Creating feedback that signals the passage of time in meaningful ways. When the brain can see time moving, it responds differently. When time is vague, it waits. As this becomes clearer, another pattern emerges. The brain does not just distort time, it uses delay as a way to manage stress. And in doing so, it often trades long-term calm for short-term relief. That trade feels reasonable in the moment, even when it leads to a familiar sense of being constantly behind. This tension between avoidance and relief leads directly into another layer of procrastination. The way stress and avoidance interact, reinforcing each other quietly, until delay becomes the default response not just to tasks, but to discomfort itself. Stress has a peculiar relationship with procrastination. On the surface, they look like opposites. Stress is often framed as the result of procrastination, the penalty you pay later for not acting sooner. And that is certainly true. Deadlines loom, pressure rises, sleep shortens, and stress appears right on schedule. But that is only half the picture. Because stress is not just a consequence of procrastination. it is also one of its most reliable causes. To understand this, it helps to look at stress not as an enemy, but as a biological response with a specific purpose. Stress evolved to help organisms deal with immediate challenges. It mobilizes energy, it narrows attention, it prepares the body to act. In situations that are short-lived and clearly defined, this response is useful. It helps you focus, respond quickly, and survive. Modern stress is rarely short-lived or clearly defined. Instead, it often comes from diffuse ongoing pressures, unfinished tasks, competing demands, unclear expectations, persistent uncertainty. The brain remains in a low-level state of activation, never fully resolving the threat, never fully relaxing. This kind of stress does not energize action. It drains capacity. When stress becomes chronic, the brain shifts priorities. Long-term planning becomes harder. Patience decreases. Emotional regulation becomes more fragile. Under these conditions, the brain is less interested in progress and more interested in relief. Avoidance provides that relief. When you step away from a stressful task, even briefly, the nervous system responds. Muscle tension decreases, anxiety softens, the sense of pressure eases. This change may be subtle, but it is enough for the brain to notice. It feels like improvement. That improvement is real in the short term, and that is what makes avoidance so effective as a coping strategy. It works. It does not solve the underlying problem, but it reduces distress right now. And the brain is heavily biased toward whatever reduces distress in the present moment. This is the short-term relief trap. Every time a task is avoided and stress decreases, the brain learns a simple association. Avoidance equals relief. That association is strengthened through repetition, even when the long-term outcome is negative. The brain does not evaluate the entire timeline. It evaluates what happens immediately after a behavior. If relief follows avoidance, avoidance is reinforced. This reinforcement happens quickly and often outside conscious awareness. You do not need to tell yourself, avoiding this makes me feel better. The nervous system registers the change automatically. Over time, avoidance becomes a default response to stress. This is why procrastination often increases during stressful periods, even when there is more to do and less time to do it. From the outside, this looks irrational. From the inside, it feels necessary. The system is overloaded and searching for ways to downshift. Stress also narrows attention. When the brain is under pressure, it becomes less capable of holding complex, multi-step plans in mind. It focuses on what feels most urgent emotionally, not what is most important strategically. Tasks that feel ambiguous or effortful drop out of focus. Immediate stressors dominate. Avoiding a task removes it from immediate awareness, at least temporarily. That removal creates a sense of control. The brain feels like it has managed the situation, even though nothing has actually changed. This illusion of control is powerful. It gives avoidance a sense of agency. You're not being overwhelmed. You're choosing to step back. That feeling matters when the system feels threatened. Another reason stress fuels procrastination is that stress changes how effort feels. Under stress, even simple tasks require more energy. The same amount of work feels heavier. Starting feels harder. The brain interprets this increased effort cost as a signal that something is wrong. Instead of recognizing that stress has altered perception, the brain often concludes that the task itself is the problem. It decides that now is not a good time, that waiting might help. This misattribution keeps the cycle going. Stress makes tasks feel harder. Tasks feeling harder increase avoidance. Avoidance increases stress later. The relief trap is especially strong when tasks are emotionally loaded. If a task is associated with fear, self-doubt, or shame, avoiding it reduces not just stress but self-critical thoughts. The brain experiences this as a significant improvement in emotional state. Over time, the task itself becomes a stress trigger. Simply thinking about it activates discomfort. Avoidance then becomes the quickest way to regulate that discomfort. This is how procrastination spreads. It starts as a response to a specific task, but gradually generalizes. The brain learns that avoidance is an effective way to manage stress in general. It begins to apply the strategy more broadly. Eventually, avoidance is no longer about a particular assignment or responsibility. It becomes a pattern of responding to internal discomfort. Any situation that produces tension is met with withdrawal. This pattern is reinforced by modern environments that make avoidance easy. Distractions are readily available. Comfort is accessible. There is always something else to do that feels less demanding. The brain does not have to sit with discomfort. It can escape it instantly. The relief is brief, but repeatable. And repeatable relief is enough to shape behavior. One of the most misleading aspects of the relief trap is that it creates the impression that stress is being managed. In reality, stress is being deferred. It is pushed into the future, where it accumulates. When the avoided task does not disappear, the brain is forced to revisit it later, often under worse conditions, less time, less energy, more pressure. The stress response intensifies. At that point, the brain may switch from avoidance to urgency-driven action. Adrenaline takes over. The task gets done in a rush. Relief follows completion. The brain then links relief not just to avoidance, but to last-minute action. It learns that stress plus urgency equals resolution. This reinforces the idea that waiting is not just tolerable, but functional. The cost of this pattern is rarely acknowledged in the moment. Sleep is disrupted, anxiety spikes, cognitive flexibility decreases. But because the task is eventually completed, the strategy appears to work. Over time, this teaches the brain to rely on stress as a motivator. Calm engagement becomes unfamiliar. Working without pressure feels strange, unmotivating, even suspicious. This is why people who procrastinate frequently often report difficulty starting tasks early, even when they want to. Without stress, there is no signal to act. The system has been trained to respond only when threat levels are high. The relief trap also interacts with self-talk. After avoiding a task, people often reassure themselves, "I'll do it later. I work better under pressure. I just need to feel more ready." These thoughts reduce guilt and anxiety in the short term. They make avoidance feel justified, but they also delay confrontation with the underlying issue. The task remains emotionally charged. Each delay adds another layer of stress. The brain then associates the task not just with its original difficulty, but with all the accumulated avoidance. Starting now means facing not only the work, but the history of delay. This makes avoidance even more appealing. Another important factor is that stress reduces access to higher-order cognitive processes. When the stress response is active, the brain prioritizes survival-oriented functions. Reflection, creativity, and long-term planning become harder to access. This means that stressed people are less able to reframe tasks, break them down, or find alternative approaches. The very skills that could reduce avoidance are temporarily unavailable. In this state, telling yourself to just do it is unlikely to help. The brain does not have the resources to comply. It hears the instruction as another demand, another stressor. Avoidance then becomes not just a choice, but a necessity for emotional regulation. The relief trap also explains why procrastination often coexists with high levels of self-criticism. People blame themselves for delaying, which increases stress. That stress then fuels further avoidance. The cycle tightens. Self-criticism feels productive because it signals concern. But it rarely reduces avoidance. It increases threat perception. And when threat increases, the brain leans more heavily on avoidance as a coping strategy. Breaking the relief trap does not mean eliminating stress. Some stress is inevitable. It means changing how stress is managed. Instead of using avoidance to regulate discomfort, the goal becomes finding ways to engage that do not overwhelm the system. This requires reducing the emotional intensity of tasks before starting, not after, making engagement feel safe enough that avoidance is no longer necessary. One way this happens is through containment, limiting how much of the task you're engaging with at once, not committing to completion, not demanding performance, just creating a small bounded interaction. When engagement is limited, stress does not spike as sharply. The nervous system remains within a tolerable range. The brain does not feel the need to escape. Another way is through predictability. When tasks are structured and familiar, stress decreases. Uncertainty is reduced. The brain feels more in control. Importantly, this is not about pushing through stress. Pushing through often reinforces the association between work and threat. It teaches the brain that engagement equals overload. What weakens the relief trap is repeated experience of engaging without being overwhelmed. Small successes, manageable starts, exposure that does not confirm fear. Over time, the brain updates its expectations. It learns that engagement does not always require crisis, that progress can occur without panic, that relief does not have to come from avoidance. This process is gradual. It does not involve dramatic breakthroughs. It involves many small moments where avoidance is replaced with tolerable engagement. As stress decreases, the need for avoidance decreases with it. The relief trap loosens its grip. Understanding this relationship between stress, avoidance, and relief also changes how procrastination is interpreted. Delay is no longer seen as stubbornness or indifference. It is seen as an attempt to cope with overload using the tools the brain has learned to rely on. Those tools are not optimal, but they are understandable. From here, the pattern extends further, because once avoidance becomes habitual, it stops being a conscious strategy and starts operating automatically. Tasks trigger avoidance without deliberate choice. Delay becomes the default response. This is where habits come into play, how repeated relief shapes behavior until procrastination no longer feels like a decision at all, but like something that simply happens, almost before you realize it has begun. At a certain point, procrastination stops feeling like something you choose. It starts to feel like something that happens. You sit down with the intention to work, and before you've consciously decided anything, you're already doing something else. Minutes pass, sometimes hours. Later you look back and wonder how it happened again. This shift from deliberate delay to automatic behavior is one of the most important turning points in understanding procrastination. Because once procrastination becomes habitual, logic, motivation, and good intentions lose much of their influence. The behavior is no longer driven primarily by conscious decision-making. It is driven by learned patterns that run quietly in the background. These patterns are known as habit loops. A habit loop is a simple neurological sequence made up of 3 elements: a cue, a behavior, and a reward. The cue triggers the behavior leads to a reward, and the reward reinforces the loop. Over time, this loop becomes faster, more efficient, and less conscious. Habits exist to conserve energy. The brain prefers routines that require minimal deliberation. When a behavior reliably produces a desirable outcome, the brain gradually offloads control from conscious systems to automatic ones. This frees up mental resources for other demands. Procrastination fits this model surprisingly well. The cue is often an internal state rather than an external event, a feeling of discomfort, uncertainty, boredom, stress. The moment a task triggers one of these states, the habit loop is activated. The behavior follows almost immediately, checking something else, switching tasks, delaying the start. The reward is not pleasure in the traditional sense, it is relief, a reduction in emotional or cognitive strain. That relief may be brief, but it is enough. The brain registers it as a successful outcome. Over time, the loop strengthens. What makes this particularly difficult to interrupt is that the cue is often subtle. You may not consciously register the moment you feel resistance. You simply feel pulled away. The behavior feels natural, almost justified. The reward arrives quickly: relief, distraction, escape. By the time you realize what has happened, the loop has already completed. This is why procrastination can feel so frustrating. People often believe they are failing to make better choices. In reality, the choice point has shifted earlier into a moment that barely reaches awareness. Habitual procrastination does not require active avoidance. It runs automatically in response to familiar internal cues. Another reason habit loops are powerful is that they bypass the brain regions involved in long-term planning. Once a behavior is habitual, it is no longer evaluated based on future consequences. It is evaluated based on past outcomes. If avoidance reduced discomfort before, the brain assumes it will do so again. This is efficient, but it is not strategic. The brain does not ask, "Is this the best option overall?" It asks, "What worked last time in this situation?" And if last time avoidance led to relief, avoidance is chosen again. This also explains why insight alone rarely breaks procrastination habits. Understanding why you procrastinate does not automatically weaken the loop. Habits are not stored as explanations, they are stored as associations. To change a habit, the association must change. Another factor that accelerates habit formation is repetition under emotional conditions. Behaviors learned under stress are encoded more strongly. The brain prioritizes learning from situations that feel significant or threatening. If procrastination repeatedly reduces stress, the habit loop becomes especially resilient. This is why procrastination often feels strongest around the same kinds of tasks: writing, studying, administrative work, anything that reliably produces discomfort. The brain learns to associate those cues with avoidance very quickly. Once established, the habit loop begins to generalize. It does not stay confined to one specific task. Similar cues trigger the same response. The moment you feel uncertain or overwhelmed, the brain defaults to avoidance, even if the task itself is different. At this stage, procrastination no longer feels like a strategy. It feels like a reflex. This reflex is reinforced by the environment. Modern environments are designed to support rapid habit formation. Immediate rewards are always available. Distractions are one tap away. The reward portion of the loop is easy to access and highly reliable. This makes the habit loop efficient. Efficient habits are hard to disrupt. Another reason habitual procrastination persists is that it often coexists with productivity bursts. When deadlines finally force action, the brain experiences a different kind of reward: relief after completion, praise, a sense of accomplishment. These outcomes complicate the learning process. The brain learns two things at once. Avoidance reduces stress in the short term. Urgency-driven action resolves the problem in the end. Together, these lessons teach the brain that the entire cycle works. What the brain does not fully account for is the cost paid along the way. The anxiety, the exhaustion, the lost time. These costs are diffuse and delayed. The rewards are clear and immediate. As a result, the habit loop remains intact. Another subtle aspect of habitual procrastination is that it reshapes identity. When a behavior repeats often enough, people begin to incorporate it into their self-concept. "I'm just someone who works better under pressure. I always procrastinate. That's just how I am." These statements feel like self-awareness, but they can actually reinforce the habit. If procrastination is part of who you are, there is less reason to question it. The brain prefers consistency. Identity provides it. This does not mean identity causes procrastination. It means habits and identity can reinforce each other over time. Habit loops also explain why willpower feels unreliable. Willpower operates at the level of conscious control. Habitual behavior operates below that level. When the two conflict, habits usually win, especially under stress or fatigue. Trying to overpower a habit with willpower is like trying to steer a car by pushing against it from the outside. You might slow it down briefly, but the underlying mechanism remains unchanged. What actually interrupts a habit loop is altering one of its components: the cue, the behavior, or the reward. Removing cues is difficult when the cues are internal. You cannot eliminate feelings of discomfort or uncertainty entirely. They are part of life. Trying to suppress them often backfires, making them more salient. Changing the behavior is also challenging when avoidance has become automatic. The brain reaches for it before conscious choice has a chance to intervene. That leaves the reward. If avoidance no longer reliably produces relief, the habit loop weakens. If engagement begins to produce relief instead, a new loop can form. This does not happen through force. It happens through experience. For example, when a person engages with a task briefly and discovers that the discomfort decreases rather than increases, the brain receives new information. The predicted threat does not materialize. Relief comes from action, not avoidance. These experiences are small but powerful. They update the brain's expectations. Over time, the cue no longer triggers the same avoidance response. Another way habit loops are disrupted is by inserting friction. When the avoidance behavior becomes less easy or less rewarding, the loop slows down. Even small delays can be enough to bring the behavior back into conscious awareness. This is why environment design matters so much. Habits thrive in frictionless conditions. Introduce friction, and automaticity breaks. Habit loops are also sensitive to timing. If a person consistently engages with tasks at the same time each day, the brain begins to associate that time with engagement rather than avoidance. The cue shifts. Time itself becomes a trigger for action. This is not about motivation. It is about conditioning. It is also important to recognize that habit loops do not disappear instantly. They weaken gradually. Old loops can resurface under stress. This does not mean failure. It means the brain is reverting to familiar patterns when resources are low. Change requires repetition under manageable conditions, not dramatic effort, but consistent exposure to alternative responses. Understanding procrastination as a habit removes much of the moral weight people attach to it. Habits are not personal flaws, they are learned responses, and learned responses can be unlearned or reshaped. This perspective also explains why people can procrastinate even when they genuinely want to act. Wanting to act operates at the level of intention. Habits operate at the level of automatic response. They do not consult intention before executing. The good news is that habits are efficient learners. They update quickly when conditions change consistently. When relief follows engagement often enough, the loop rewires. As this understanding settles in, another factor becomes impossible to ignore. The state of the body itself, energy levels, sleep, physical exhaustion. Because habits do not operate in isolation. They are influenced heavily by how rested or depleted the system is. When the body is tired, habits dominate. When energy is low, the brain relies even more on automatic responses. This is where sleep enters the picture, not as a lifestyle preference, but as a central regulator of whether procrastination remains a reflex or begins to loosen its hold. There is a version of procrastination that looks almost identical to the usual pattern, but has a very different root. It isn't driven primarily by fear, perfectionism, or habit. It comes from something more basic, a tired brain trying to conserve what little energy it has left. When people are exhausted, procrastination increases, not slightly, not occasionally, but reliably. Tasks feel heavier, starting feels harder, distractions feel more tempting. This is not a coincidence, and it is not a personal failing. It is a biological response to depleted resources. The brain is an energy-intensive organ. Even at rest, it consumes a large share of the body's available fuel. When you are well rested, that fuel supports planning, self-regulation, emotional balance, and sustained attention. When you're sleep-deprived or chronically fatigued, the brain has to make trade-offs. And one of the first systems to be compromised is the one responsible for effortful control. Sleep plays a central role in restoring that system. During sleep, especially deep sleep, the brain clears metabolic waste, consolidates memory, and recalibrates neural networks involved in attention and emotion. This is not maintenance for luxury functions, it is basic upkeep. Without it, the brain operates in a reduced capacity mode. In that mode, the brain becomes conservative. It avoids unnecessary effort. It narrows focus. It prioritizes immediate needs over long-term goals. Procrastination becomes more likely because the brain is no longer equipped to tolerate discomfort in service of future benefit. This shift is subtle, but powerful. When you are tired, the same task that felt manageable earlier can suddenly feel overwhelming. Not because the task has changed, but because your ability to engage with it has. The brain's threshold for effort drops. Activities that require sustained attention, decision-making, or emotional regulation become harder to initiate. At the same time, the brain becomes more sensitive to immediate rewards. Sleep deprivation increases reactivity in reward-related circuits, while reducing activity in areas responsible for impulse control. The balance shifts toward whatever feels easiest and most comforting right now. This combination is ideal for procrastination. Avoidance requires less effort than engagement. Distraction requires less effort than focus. Delay requires less effort than commitment. A tired brain gravitates toward all three. Another effect of poor sleep is impaired emotional regulation. When rested, the brain can tolerate mild frustration, uncertainty, and boredom. When tired, those same emotions feel sharper. Irritation comes faster. Anxiety lingers longer. The emotional cost of starting increases. Tasks that already carry emotional weight become even harder to approach. The brain interprets them as threats to limited resources. Avoidance becomes protective rather than indulgent. This is one reason procrastination often worsens late at night. Not because night itself causes delay, but because fatigue accumulates. By the end of the day, the brain has spent energy on decisions, interactions, and self-control. Sleep pressure is high. The system is preparing to shut down. Trying to force progress at this point often backfires. The brain resists. It looks for low-effort activities. It delays anything that might increase strain. This pattern becomes especially pronounced for people who are chronically sleep-deprived. When poor sleep is the norm rather than the exception, procrastination becomes more persistent. The brain is almost always operating below optimal capacity. In this state, advice focused on motivation or discipline feels hollow. The problem is not a lack of desire to act. It is a lack of energy to support action. Energy is not just physical. It is cognitive and emotional. Sleep deprivation reduces working memory capacity, making it harder to hold task details in mind. It reduces cognitive flexibility, making it harder to switch strategies. It reduces patience, making effort feel more aversive. All of these changes increase delay. Sleep also affects how the brain perceives time. When tired, time estimation becomes less accurate. Tasks feel longer than they are. The future feels more distant. Deadlines feel both closer and harder to engage with. This distortion further undermines planning and initiation. Another overlooked aspect of sleep is its role in habit regulation. Habits, including procrastination habits, become more dominant when the brain is fatigued. Automatic responses take over because conscious control is weakened. This means that even if someone has made progress reducing procrastination, those gains can disappear temporarily during periods of poor sleep. Old patterns resurface, not because change has failed, but because the system is underpowered. This can be discouraging if it is misunderstood. People often interpret these setbacks as proof that they are incapable of change. In reality, they are seeing the effects of depleted energy on behavior. Sleep also influences self-perception. When tired, people tend to be more self-critical. They interpret difficulty as personal failure rather than situational limitation. This self-criticism increases stress, which further depletes energy. The result is a feedback loop. Poor sleep increases procrastination. Procrastination increases stress. Stress disrupts sleep. Over time, this loop can become entrenched. Breaking it does not require perfection. It requires recognizing sleep as a foundational variable rather than an optional enhancement. Even small improvements in sleep quality can produce noticeable changes in procrastination. Not because sleep makes people suddenly motivated, but because it restores the brain's ability to tolerate effort and discomfort. This is why people often report that tasks feel easier after a good night's sleep, even though nothing about the tasks has changed. The system responsible for engagement has been replenished. Energy also fluctuates throughout the day. Many people have predictable rhythms, peaks of alertness, troughs of fatigue. Procrastination often aligns with these troughs. Ignoring these rhythms and trying to work against them increases avoidance. Working with them reduces resistance. This is not about optimizing productivity. It is about reducing unnecessary strain. For example, attempting deep, demanding work during a natural low-energy period requires significantly more effort. The brain resists. Delay becomes more likely. Shifting that work to a higher energy window reduces friction. This does not require rigid scheduling. It requires awareness. Noticing when effort feels disproportionately costly, and recognizing that the cost may be physiological rather than psychological. Another important factor is cumulative sleep debt. Even modest sleep loss spread over many nights can impair cognitive function. People often underestimate this effect because it accumulates gradually. They adapt subjectively while performance continues to decline. In this state, procrastination can feel inexplicable. The person believes they should be able to act. They may not feel particularly tired, but the brain's capacity is still reduced. This mismatch between perception and capacity leads to frustration. The person pushes harder. The brain pushes back. Avoidance follows. Understanding this dynamic changes how procrastination is interpreted. Delay is no longer seen solely as a failure of intention or strategy. It is seen as a signal that the system may be depleted. This does not mean sleep solves procrastination on its own. It does not. But without sufficient sleep, other strategies become harder to implement. Insight does not translate into action. Plans do not stick. Habits revert. Sleep is not a productivity hack. It is infrastructure. There is also a cultural layer to this issue. Many environments implicitly reward sleep deprivation. Long hours, late nights, constant availability. In these contexts, procrastination is often framed as a moral failure rather than a predictable outcome of exhaustion. This framing compounds the problem. People blame themselves for behaviors that are being driven by biology. They apply pressure instead of addressing the underlying constraint. Pressure may produce short bursts of action, but it does not restore energy. In fact, it often accelerates depletion. A rested brain is not lazy. It is capable. It can hold goals in mind. It can tolerate discomfort. It can delay gratification. A tired brain cannot do these things reliably. Recognizing this does not mean waiting until you feel perfectly rested to act. That would be another version of the illusion of the right moment. It means adjusting expectations based on capacity. On days when energy is low, starting may need to be smaller, more contained, less ambitious. Not because standards are lower, but because the system has limits. When those limits are respected, engagement becomes possible again. When they are ignored, avoidance becomes inevitable. Sleep also affects learning. When sleep is insufficient, the brain struggles to update habits. New patterns do not consolidate as effectively. This makes behavior change slower and more fragile. This is why people often find that progress made during well-rested periods slips during times of fatigue. The new patterns have not yet been fully encoded. Over time, with consistent sleep, those patterns stabilize. Procrastination becomes less automatic. Starting becomes less threatening. This does not happen quickly. It happens gradually, often without dramatic awareness. Tasks begin to feel slightly lighter. Resistance softens. delay shortens. From there, attention naturally shifts to the environment itself, because even a rested brain is influenced by what surrounds it. Modern environments are saturated with distractions designed to capture attention and offer effortless relief. Understanding how energy interacts with environment leads directly into the next layer. How constant stimulation and easy distraction create an always later atmosphere, one where delay is not just possible, but continually encouraged. There is nothing accidental about how easy it has become to delay. Procrastination did not suddenly increase because human nature changed. What changed was the environment. The world most people now work and live in is structured in a way that consistently favours postponement, interruption, and fragmented attention. Delay is no longer an occasional choice, it is the default setting. This environment creates what can be thought of as an always later atmosphere. Not a specific instruction to avoid work, but a constant suggestion that whatever you're doing can wait. That there is no need to engage fully right now. That something else is available, something easier, something lighter, something that can be checked just for a moment. The brain did not evolve in conditions like this. For most of human history, attention was shaped by scarcity. Information was limited, stimulation was intermittent, distractions existed, but they were not engineered to be persistent, personalized, and instantly accessible. When work needed to be done, there were fewer competing signals pulling attention away from it. Modern environments reverse that balance. Attention is now the scarce resource, and nearly everything competes for it. From the brain's perspective, this competition matters more than intention. You can want to focus. You can plan to focus. But wanting is not enough when the environment continually presents alternatives that promise immediate engagement with minimal effort. Distractions today are not neutral interruptions. They are carefully designed systems that leverage the brain's reward circuitry. Notifications, updates, feeds, and alerts are structured to create anticipation, novelty, and intermittent reinforcement. These are exactly the conditions under which attention becomes sticky and habits form quickly. When a task requires sustained effort and produces delayed rewards, it is at a disadvantage in this environment. It must compete against options that deliver instant feedback, emotional regulation, and a sense of movement without demanding commitment. The result is not that people choose distraction over work. It is that distraction is constantly chosen for them, by default, unless active effort is applied to resist it. This creates a background state of partial attention. Even when people are technically working, their focus is fragile. The mind remains slightly open, waiting for something else to arrive. This openness makes starting harder and stopping easier. Procrastination thrives under these conditions because delay no longer feels like a clear decision. It feels like drift. Another feature of the always later environment is that it fragments time. Work is no longer bounded by clear beginnings and endings. Tasks bleed into each other. Messages arrive at all hours. The distinction between work time and non-work time becomes blurry. When time feels fragmented, commitment feels risky. Starting a task feels like inviting interruption. The brain anticipates disruption and becomes reluctant to invest effort that may be wasted. This anticipation is not irrational. Interruptions are common. Focus is fragile. The brain learns that sustained engagement is likely to be broken. Under those conditions, avoidance becomes a way of protecting effort. Why start something if you won't be able to finish it cleanly? This leads to another subtle shift. People begin to wait not just for motivation or clarity, but for uninterrupted time. A block of time that feels safe enough to begin. That block rarely appears. The day fills with small demands, short messages, minor tasks, low-level obligations. Each one feels manageable on its own. Together they consume attention and energy. By the time a meaningful task is considered, the day already feels spent. The brain postpones engagement, telling itself that it will be better tomorrow. tomorrow arrives with the same structure. The always later environment also changes how people perceive effort. When effort is constantly interrupted, it begins to feel inefficient. People associate work with frustration rather than progress. Distraction offers a smoother experience, fewer obstacles, fewer stops and starts. Over time, the brain learns that distraction feels better not just emotionally, but procedurally. It flows, it responds, it adapts. Work, by contrast, feels rigid and demanding. This learning is reinforced by modern tools that make switching tasks effortless. One tap, one click, one glance. The cost of disengaging from a task is extremely low. When disengagement is cheap, persistence becomes rare. The brain adapts to this low cost quickly. It stops preparing for sustained effort. It expects escape routes to be available. When a task becomes uncomfortable, leaving it feels natural. This does not require conscious decision-making. The habit forms quietly. Another important feature of the always later environment is abundance. There is always more content, more information, more options. This abundance creates a sense that nothing needs to be finished now, because nothing is ever finished. When everything is ongoing, completion loses its urgency. Tasks without clear endpoints are especially vulnerable. Many modern responsibilities are open-ended. Emails can always be refined. Projects can always be improved. Research can always continue. The brain struggles to identify when effort is sufficient. Distraction offers clearer feedback. You scroll and something new appears. You check and something changes. The interaction feels complete in a way that many work tasks do not. This difference matters. The brain is sensitive to closure. Without it, effort feels unsatisfying. The always later environment also normalizes delay socially. It is now common to respond later, watch later, read later, start later. Digital tools are designed around cues and reminders. Everything can be postponed without immediate consequence. This normalization reduces friction around delay. Procrastination no longer feels like an exception. It feels like the expected mode of engagement. When delay is normalized, urgency loses its meaning. If everything can be done later, nothing demands attention now. This creates a subtle erosion of commitment. People intend to do many things, but commit to few in the present moment. Intention without action becomes common. Over time, this weakens trust in one's own plans. The brain notices this pattern. It learns that plans are flexible, optional, and frequently revised. As a result, it takes intentions less seriously. This does not mean people become careless. It means intentions lose motivational weight. They no longer trigger preparation or action reliably. Another effect of constant distraction is that it increases baseline stress. Even when people are not consciously stressed, their nervous systems remain slightly activated. Attention is pulled in multiple directions. Alerts and updates create a sense of ongoing demand. This low-level stress makes effort feel heavier. Starting becomes more aversive. Avoidance becomes more appealing. Distraction then serves a dual role. It provides relief from stress and reinforces the habit of postponement. The brain learns that disengaging reduces pressure, even if only briefly. The always later environment also interferes with boredom. Boredom used to serve a function. It created space for reflection and sustained engagement. When there was nothing else to do, effort was often the most interesting option available. Now boredom is almost impossible to experience fully. The moment boredom appears, it can be eliminated instantly. The brain no longer learns to tolerate low stimulation in service of longer goals. This intolerance matters. Many tasks require moving through periods of low stimulation before progress becomes visible. Writing, studying, problem-solving, and creative work all involve stretches where nothing exciting happens. If the brain has not practiced staying present during these stretches, avoidance becomes likely. Distraction offers immediate stimulation without requiring patience. Over time, this reduces the brain's threshold for engagement. Tasks need to be interesting immediately or they're abandoned. The always later environment also encourages multitasking, which feels efficient but often undermines progress. Switching between tasks fragments attention and increases cognitive load. Each switch carries a cost. These costs accumulate. The brain becomes fatigued. Decision fatigue increases. The likelihood of delay rises. Ironically, multitasking can increase procrastination by creating the illusion of busyness. People feel occupied, even productive, without making meaningful progress on the tasks they most want to avoid. This illusion reduces urgency. If you feel busy, it is easier to justify delay. The brain assumes effort is already being expended. Another aspect of the environment that encourages procrastination is constant connectivity. The expectation of availability makes disengagement feel risky. People hesitate to start deep work because they fear missing something. This fear does not need to be explicit. It operates quietly. The brain keeps attention slightly open, ready to respond. That openness prevents full immersion. Without immersion, progress is slower. Slower progress increases frustration. Frustration increases avoidance. The cycle reinforces itself. The always later environment also distorts feedback. In many digital contexts, feedback is immediate and visible. Likes, replies, updates. Work tasks often provide delayed or ambiguous feedback. You may not know if you are doing well until much later. The brain prefers clear feedback. Without it, motivation wanes. Distraction fills the gap. Another factor is the blending of work and rest. When the same devices are used for both, the boundary between effort and recovery blurs. The brain struggles to switch modes cleanly. This makes rest less restorative and work less focused. Both suffer. Procrastination increases because neither mode feels fully available. People often respond to this by trying to optimize their tools or schedules, but optimization alone rarely addresses the deeper issue. The environment continually signals that commitment is optional and interruption is normal. To counter this, the brain needs stronger cues for engagement. Not motivation, but structure. Structure reduces choice. It limits options. It creates boundaries. When structure is absent, the brain defaults to whatever is easiest. This is why environments that support focus often feel restrictive. They reduce access to distraction. They narrow attention. They remove alternatives. The brain initially resists this, but over time it adapts. When distraction is less available, engagement becomes more likely. Not because the brain suddenly prefers effort, but because effort no longer competes with constant alternatives. The always later environment also interacts with identity. When people repeatedly delay, they may begin to see themselves as unreliable or unfocused. This self-concept reinforces avoidance. Why start if you expect not to follow through? This expectation becomes self-fulfilling. The brain aligns behavior with identity. Changing this requires experience, not belief. Experience of engagement in environments that support it. Experience of starting without constant interruption. Experience of finishing without panic. None of this requires eliminating technology or retreating from modern life. It requires intentional boundaries, friction, design choices that favor commitment over convenience. The key point is that procrastination is not happening in a vacuum. It is being continuously encouraged by an environment that rewards delay, interruption, and partial engagement. Understanding this removes a great deal of self-blame. It clarifies why good intentions are not enough. It explains why procrastination feels easier now than it might have in the past, and it points toward a different kind of solution. Not more discipline, but better alignment between human attention and the spaces it operates in. As attention becomes harder to sustain, another pattern begins to emerge. People start relying on pressure to cut through distraction. Deadlines become the only reliable way to focus. This reliance on pressure feels effective in the short term, but it comes with its own costs. That dynamic, the way pressure sometimes works and often backfires, is the next piece of the story. Pressure has a strange reputation. It is often spoken about with a mix of frustration and admiration, as if it were a dangerous but effective tool. People say things like, "I work best under pressure," or "I just need a deadline to get going." These statements are not lies. Pressure really can produce action. It can cut through hesitation, silence doubt, and force focus in a way that nothing else seems to manage. But what pressure gives, it also takes. And over time, it usually takes more than it gives. To understand why pressure sometimes works and why it so often backfires, it helps to look at what pressure actually is from the brain's point of view. Pressure is not motivation. It is not clarity. It is not discipline. Pressure is a stress response. When a deadline becomes close enough to feel threatening, the brain shifts into a different mode of operation. Stress hormones increase, attention narrows, the nervous system mobilizes energy. Distractions fade, not because they are no longer appealing, but because the brain temporarily deprioritizes everything that is not directly related to resolving the threat. In this state, procrastination often disappears. The task that felt impossible to start suddenly feels unavoidable. The uncertainty that once caused hesitation is replaced by urgency. There is no longer time to debate the best approach or wait for the right moment. Action becomes the only viable option. From the outside, this can look like a breakthrough. Someone who delayed for weeks suddenly becomes intensely productive. They focus for hours. They push through fatigue. They finish the task just in time. The outcome may even be good. This experience is powerful. It leaves a strong impression, and the brain remembers it. What the brain learns in these moments is not that pressure is unpleasant. It already knew that. What it learns is that pressure works, that when stress reaches a certain level, action follows, that discomfort can be resolved through urgency-driven effort. This learning is reinforced by relief. When the task is completed and the deadline passes, stress drops sharply. Relief floods in. The contrast is dramatic. The brain links relief not just to completion, but to the entire sequence that led up to it. Avoidance, escalating pressure, urgent action, resolution. From a learning perspective, this sequence appears effective. The task gets done. The threat is neutralized. Relief follows. The brain concludes that the system works as designed. What the brain does not evaluate accurately is the cost paid along the way. Pressure-driven action relies heavily on stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. These chemicals are useful in short bursts. They sharpen focus and increase energy availability. But they also suppress functions that are not immediately relevant to survival, such as creativity, reflection, and emotional nuance. Under pressure, people often do not think expansively. They think narrowly. They aim to finish, not to explore. They choose familiar approaches over novel ones. They prioritize speed over depth. This can be appropriate for some tasks. It is not ideal for many others. More importantly, repeated reliance on pressure comes with cumulative costs. Stress hormones disrupt sleep. They increase irritability. They impair immune function. They reduce cognitive flexibility. Over time, they make it harder for the brain to regulate emotion and attention without external threat. This means that the more someone relies on pressure to initiate action, the less capable they become of acting without it. Pressure becomes the trigger. This is where the backfire begins. When pressure is the primary driver of productivity, calm engagement starts to feel unfamiliar. Without urgency, the brain does not receive a clear signal to act. Motivation feels absent. Focus drifts. Tasks feel flat and uninteresting. People often interpret this as laziness or lack of passion. In reality, it is conditioning. The brain has learned to associate action with threat. Without threat, it waits. This conditioning explains why people who consistently work under pressure often struggle to start early, even when they want to, even when they know it would reduce stress, even when they have time. The system does not respond to time alone, it responds to danger. Another way pressure backfires is by increasing avoidance earlier in the process. If the brain expects that engagement will eventually lead to intense stress, it tries to delay that stress for as long as possible. Avoidance becomes more appealing, not less. In other words, reliance on pressure can strengthen procrastination. This creates a paradox. Pressure solves the immediate problem, but it makes the long-term pattern worse. Each cycle reinforces the association between work and distress. Over time, tasks feel heavier earlier, not lighter. This is why people often say that procrastination seems to get worse with age or responsibility. It is not just because tasks become more complex. It is because the accumulated stress history attached to work grows. Another important cost of pressure is its effect on self-trust. When people repeatedly wait until the last minute, they learn something about themselves. They learn that their intentions are unreliable, that plans made in advance are unlikely to be followed, that they cannot trust themselves to act without external force. This erosion of self-trust matters. When you do not trust yourself to start early, you stop expecting yourself to. You stop making realistic plans. You assume delay is inevitable. This assumption quietly shapes behavior. Why prepare thoroughly if you know you will rush later? Why break tasks into steps if you believe you will ignore them? The brain adapts expectations downward. This does not feel like giving up. It feels like realism, but it limits options. Pressure also changes how people relate to time. When deadlines are always associated with panic, time becomes something to fear rather than something to use. The future feels threatening rather than supportive. This makes planning aversive. Thinking ahead increases anxiety rather than clarity. Avoidance extends not just to tasks but to time itself. Another subtle effect of pressure is that it reduces learning. When tasks are completed under extreme urgency, there is little opportunity for reflection. People move quickly from crisis to relief. The brain does not spend time evaluating what worked or what could be improved. As a result, mistakes are repeated. Inefficient strategies persist. This cycle resets without refinement. Pressure-driven work also tends to be brittle. It depends on high arousal. When something disrupts that arousal, illness, exhaustion, unexpected complications, the system collapses. There is no buffer. This fragility increases anxiety, which increases reliance on pressure, which increases avoidance earlier. The loop tightens. Another reason pressure backfires is that it crowds out intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation depends on curiosity, interest, and a sense of autonomy. Pressure replaces these with obligation and fear. When tasks are consistently approached under pressure, they lose whatever intrinsic appeal they may have had. Work becomes something to survive rather than something to engage with. This makes future engagement harder. Even people who once enjoyed certain activities can lose that enjoyment when those activities become associated with chronic stress. It is also important to note that pressure does not work equally well for everyone. Some people are more sensitive to stress than others. For these individuals, pressure does not sharpen focus. It overwhelms it. Under pressure, they may freeze rather than act, or they may engage in frantic, unproductive activity, or they may shut down emotionally. For them, pressure backfires immediately. This variability is often misunderstood. People who function under pressure may assume that pressure is universally effective. They may recommend it as a solution. For others, this advice is harmful. Even for those who appear to work well under pressure, there are often hidden costs. Sleep disruption, anxiety, reduced satisfaction, burnout. These costs may not be obvious in the short term, but they accumulate. Another issue with pressure is that it narrows the definition of success. Under pressure, success becomes completion, finishing on time, avoiding negative consequences. This focus is understandable, but it can be limiting. It discourages experimentation. It discourages learning. It discourages depth. Over time, people may stop aiming for growth or improvement and aim only for survival. This can be demoralizing even if tasks are technically being completed. Pressure also interacts with perfectionism in complex ways. For some people, pressure temporarily silences perfectionism. There is no time to be perfect. Action becomes unavoidable. This can feel liberating. But this relief is misleading. It teaches the brain that perfectionism can be managed only through crisis, that the only way to escape high standards is to wait until time runs out. This reinforces both perfectionism and procrastination. The brain learns that calm, imperfect engagement is not acceptable. Only rushed, pressured imperfection is allowed. This is not a sustainable balance. Another way pressure backfires is by reducing awareness of internal signals. Under stress, people are less attuned to fatigue, hunger, and emotional needs. They push through. This can be adaptive in emergencies. It is damaging when it becomes routine. Over time, ignoring these signals leads to burnout. Burnout reduces capacity further. Procrastination increases. The irony is that pressure is often used to compensate for low energy, but it actually depletes energy further. So why does pressure keep being used? Because it works just enough. It produces visible results. It resolves immediate problems. It allows people to meet external expectations. It creates dramatic before and after moments that feel convincing. What it does not do is create a stable foundation for consistent engagement. The alternative is not eliminating deadlines or avoiding responsibility. Deadlines are necessary. External structure matters. The issue is relying on pressure as the primary driver rather than as a boundary. When pressure functions as a boundary, it defines limits without dominating the entire process. When pressure functions as a driver, it takes over. Healthy engagement often involves mild constraint without threat, clear expectations without panic, structure without crisis. This kind of engagement does not produce dramatic surges of productivity. It produces steady movement. It may feel less impressive, but it is more sustainable. The brain responds differently in this mode. Stress levels remain manageable. Cognitive flexibility stays intact. Learning is possible. Motivation does not depend on fear. Importantly, this mode does not eliminate procrastination entirely. Delay still happens. Resistance still appears. But it does not escalate into cycles of avoidance and panic. Pressure has a role. It can signal importance. It can prompt action when other signals fail. But when it becomes the only signal the brain responds to, it creates dependence. Understanding why pressure sometimes works helps explain why it is so tempting to rely on. Understanding why it backfires explains why that reliance eventually becomes a problem. As this becomes clearer, attention naturally turns toward a common belief that often underlies pressure-based thinking. The idea that motivation must come first, that action depends on feeling ready, driven, or inspired. That belief turns out to be another source of delay, and examining it reveals why waiting to feel motivated often keeps action permanently out of reach, even when pressure is available as a last resort. Motivation is often treated as the missing ingredient. When people talk about procrastination, they tend to frame it as a problem of insufficient desire. If only you wanted it badly enough, if only you felt inspired, if only motivation would show up, everything else would fall into place. Action would follow naturally. This belief is deeply ingrained. It shapes how people wait, how they judge themselves, and how they explain delay. And it is one of the most persistent myths surrounding human behavior. Motivation does not usually come first. From the brain's perspective, motivation is not a prerequisite for action. It is often a result of action. Waiting to feel motivated before starting is one of the most reliable ways to ensure that starting never happens. The brain does not generate motivation in a vacuum. Motivation emerges in response to cues, feedback, and movement. Without engagement, there is little for the motivational system to respond to. This creates a paradox that traps many people. They wait to feel motivated in order to begin, but the act of beginning is what would generate motivation in the first place. The system stalls. To understand why this happens, it helps to look at what motivation actually is. Motivation is not a single force. It is a combination of expectation, perceived reward, emotional readiness, and energy availability. All of these elements are influenced by context. When a task feels vague, difficult, or emotionally charged, the brain does not expect reward. When reward is not expected, motivation is low. This is not a flaw. It is a rational response based on incomplete information. The brain is cautious. It does not invest energy without some indication that the investment will pay off. When a task has not been started, there is very little information available. The outcome is uncertain. The effort required is unclear. The potential reward is abstract. Under these conditions, the motivational system stays quiet. This is why motivation often feels absent at the beginning of tasks and more present later. As soon as you begin, even in a small way, information becomes available. The task becomes clearer, the steps become more concrete. Feedback appears, the brain can now assess progress. That assessment often leads to increased motivation. This sequence runs counter to how people are taught to think about action. Many believe that motivation should precede effort, that you should feel ready, interested, or driven before you start. When that feeling does not appear, they interpret it as a signal to wait. But the absence of motivation is not a signal to delay. It is the default state when information is incomplete. Another reason the motivation myth persists is that people remember moments when motivation did appear first. Sudden bursts of inspiration, clear desire, strong emotional drive. These experiences are memorable because they feel good and make action feel effortless. What is forgotten is how rare these moments are and how unreliable they are as a foundation for consistent behavior. Motivation that appears spontaneously is usually triggered by changes in emotion, environment, or urgency, a looming deadline, a conversation, a surge of interest. These triggers are unpredictable. Building a system that depends on them leaves long stretches of inactivity in between. The brain does not treat motivation as a constant resource. It treats it as a fluctuating signal. Waiting for it is like waiting for ideal weather conditions. Sometimes they arrive, often they don't. Another factor that weakens motivation at the start is emotional resistance. Tasks that trigger fear, boredom, or self-doubt suppress motivational signals. The brain does not motivate toward experiences it predicts will be unpleasant. This suppression is automatic. You do not decide not to feel motivated. The brain simply does not generate the signal. People often respond to this by trying to force motivation. They seek inspiration. They consume content about productivity. They wait for the right mindset. These efforts can feel productive, but they often delay action further. This is because motivation cannot be summoned through reasoning alone. Telling yourself that a task is important does not necessarily make it feel motivating. Importance and motivation are not the same thing. Importance is a cognitive judgment. Motivation is an emotional and physiological state. The brain does not always align the two. This misalignment is especially clear in long-term goals. Many people care deeply about outcomes that require sustained effort. Health, education, creative projects, meaningful work. Yet caring does not guarantee motivation in the moment. The brain prioritizes immediate emotional state over abstract values. This is not because values are weak. It is because emotions are more actionable. This leads to another common misunderstanding. People believe that lack of motivation means lack of commitment. They conclude that if they truly wanted something, they would feel driven to act. This conclusion is inaccurate and harmful. Commitment exists at the level of values and identity. Motivation exists at the level of moment-to-moment experience. The two can be completely misaligned without invalidating either. You can be deeply committed to something and still feel no motivation to work on it today. What actually starts action most of the time is not motivation. It is structure. Structure reduces uncertainty. It limits options. It defines boundaries. When structure is present, the brain does not need to generate motivation to decide what to do. The decision has already been made. This is why people often find it easier to act when expectations are clear and external. A class schedule, a meeting time, a clear request from someone else. In these situations, motivation is not required. Action is triggered by context. The brain responds well to cues. When a cue reliably signals that a certain behavior should occur, the behavior becomes easier to initiate. Over time, it may become automatic. This is also why starting with very small actions is effective. Small actions reduce the cost of engagement. They provide information without demanding commitment. The brain can tolerate them even when motivation is low. Once engagement begins, the motivational system often activates. Not dramatically, but enough. Enough to continue for a while. Enough to move forward. This sequence is common but underappreciated. Action leads to clarity. Clarity leads to motivation. Motivation leads to sustained action. When people reverse this sequence, they get stuck. Another reason motivation feels unreliable is that it is highly sensitive to energy levels. When tired, stressed, or emotionally depleted, motivation drops. The brain conserves energy by reducing drive. This does not mean the task is unimportant. It means the system is overloaded. Waiting for motivation under these conditions can lead to indefinite delay. The system may never feel ready because it is never fully rested. This is why strategies that rely on motivation often fail during busy or stressful periods. They assume a baseline level of energy that may not exist. What works better is reducing the energy required to start. This can be done by simplifying the task, limiting duration, or lowering the initial bar for engagement. Not lowering standards for the final outcome, but lowering the cost of entry. The brain is more willing to engage when the perceived cost is low, even if motivation is absent. Another important point is that motivation is not evenly distributed across tasks. People often feel motivated to do some things and not others. This difference is often interpreted as preference or personality. In reality, it is often a reflection of how tasks are structured. Tasks that provide immediate feedback, clear progress, or emotional satisfaction generate motivation more easily. Tasks that are ambiguous, delayed, or emotionally loaded do not. Changing the structure of a task can change how motivating it feels, without changing the person. This is why reframing tasks can be effective, not through positive thinking, but through concrete changes in how effort and feedback are arranged. For example, committing to a short, fixed period of work rather than an open-ended goal reduces uncertainty. The brain knows when the effort will end. This makes engagement more tolerable. Similarly, making progress visible, even in small ways, gives the motivational system something to respond to. The brain needs evidence that effort matters. Another misconception about motivation is that it should be stable. People expect to feel consistently motivated if they are doing the right things. When motivation fluctuates, they assume something is wrong. In reality, motivation is inherently unstable. It varies with mood, energy, environment, and context. Expecting it to be constant creates unrealistic standards. When people believe they should feel motivated before acting, they interpret normal fluctuations as obstacles. They wait for a state that is not meant to be permanent. This waiting can become a habit of checking in with internal state before acting. Do I feel like it? When the answer is no, action is postponed. This habit trains the brain to treat motivation as a gatekeeper. Without motivation, no action occurs. Over time, this reduces tolerance for effort. The brain becomes less practiced at acting without internal drive. Motivation becomes not just a preference, but a requirement. Breaking this pattern does not mean ignoring internal state. It means decoupling action from motivation. Action does not require enthusiasm. It requires permission. Permission to begin imperfectly. Permission to stop early. permission to engage without commitment to completion. When action is permitted under these conditions, the brain often relaxes, the perceived threat decreases, engagement becomes possible. Another reason motivation myths persist is that society tends to celebrate outcomes rather than processes. People see finished projects, not the messy starts. They see confident performance, not hesitation. This creates the impression that motivated people act smoothly and consistently. The reality is usually different. Most action begins with reluctance, uncertainty, or mild resistance. These feelings are not signs to stop. They are normal features of starting. Understanding this removes some of the pressure to feel ready. It reframes resistance as part of the process rather than a barrier to it. What actually starts action, in most cases, is not desire, but containment, a limited scope, a defined time, a clear cue. This containment reduces the brain's need to evaluate. There is nothing to decide. The decision has been made in advance. This is why routines are powerful. Not because they make tasks enjoyable, but because they remove the question of whether to act. When something is routine, motivation is irrelevant. The brain simply follows the pattern. This does not mean routines eliminate resistance. It means resistance no longer controls behavior. Another key factor in starting action is trust. Trust that beginning will not lead to overwhelming demands. Trust that effort can stop. Trust that imperfection is acceptable. When trust is low, the brain hesitates. When trust is high, engagement is easier. Trust is built through experience, not persuasion, through repeated exposure to starting and discovering that the outcome is tolerable. Each of these experiences weakens the belief that motivation must come first. Over time, people begin to notice something surprising. They start tasks without feeling motivated, and once they start, motivation often appears. Not always, not dramatically, but enough. This realization can be unsettling at first. It contradicts deeply held beliefs about how action works, but it is also freeing. It removes the need to wait for internal conditions to change. Action becomes something you can initiate regardless of mood. This does not turn people into machines. It does not eliminate emotion. It simply recognizes that emotion is not a reliable guide for when to begin. As this understanding settles in, attention naturally shifts to the smallest unit of action itself. Not motivation, not planning, not pressure, but the act of beginning. Because if motivation does not start action, something else must. And that something turns out to be surprisingly small. Understanding how the brain responds to beginnings, and why starting is often the hardest part, opens the door to a different approach, one that focuses less on sustaining effort and more on crossing the initial threshold, gently, without fanfare. That threshold is where most procrastination lives, and it is where the next part of the story continues. The moment before starting is often heavier than the work itself. People describe it as resistance, inertia, or mental fog, but underneath those words is a very specific experience. The brain is facing uncertainty. It does not yet know what the task will demand, how difficult it will feel, or whether the effort will be worth it. In that moment, the brain hesitates, not because it is incapable, but because it is waiting for information. Starting provides that information. This is why the smallest possible beginning has such an outsized effect on procrastination. It is not because small steps are magically motivating. It is because they change how the brain evaluates the situation. They transform a vague, threatening unknown into something concrete and bounded. Before starting, the task exists only as an abstract representation. Abstract tasks are hard for the brain to simulate accurately. They feel larger, more complex, and more emotionally charged than they often are in practice. The brain fills in missing details with worst-case assumptions. Effort is overestimated, difficulty is exaggerated, time requirements are distorted. This distortion is not pessimism, it is caution. When you begin, even in a very limited way, that distortion collapses. The task becomes real rather than imagined. The brain receives sensory feedback, words on a page, a cursor moving, a physical action completed. This feedback grounds the task in the present moment. Grounding reduces threat. From a neurological perspective, starting shifts activity away from regions associated with rumination and threat monitoring and toward regions involved in task engagement. The brain moves from simulation to execution. This shift alone can reduce anxiety, even if the task itself remains challenging. This is why people often report that starting feels relieving rather than stressful, despite expecting the opposite. The fear was tied to anticipation, not to action. Small beginnings work because they minimize the cost of engagement. They do not require commitment to completion. They do not demand sustained effort. They simply require entry. The brain is far more willing to grant permission for entry than for completion. When a task is framed as "finish this," the brain anticipates prolonged effort, possible failure, and extended discomfort. When a task is framed as "open this," "look at this," or "do this for a few minutes," the anticipated cost drops sharply. This reduction matters more than motivation. The brain constantly weighs cost against benefit. When cost appears low, engagement becomes more likely, even if benefit is unclear. Small beginnings tip that balance just enough to allow movement. Another important effect of starting is that it creates momentum, but not in the way momentum is usually described. Momentum is often imagined as a burst of energy that carries you forward. In reality, momentum is often cognitive. It is the reduction of friction between one action and the next. Once you are already engaged, continuing requires less effort than starting did. The brain has already switched modes. The decision to act has already been made. Each additional action feels less like a choice and more like a continuation. This does not mean that starting guarantees sustained work. It means that starting removes the largest barrier. What happens next depends on many factors, including energy, clarity, and environment. But without starting, none of those factors can be assessed accurately. Small beginnings also help by redefining success. When the goal is simply to begin, success is immediate. You either did or you did not take the first step. There is no complex evaluation, no comparison, no judgment about quality. This immediacy provides a subtle reward, not excitement, but completion of a clear objective. The brain registers this as progress. That progress signal matters. It tells the brain that effort produces results, even minimal results. Over time, this association weakens the belief that effort is pointless or overwhelming. Another reason small beginnings are effective is that they reduce identity threat. When starting is framed as exploratory rather than performative, the brain feels less exposed. You're not proving anything. You're simply interacting with the task. This distinction is crucial for people whose procrastination is driven by fear or perfectionism. A small beginning does not carry the same weight as a full commitment. There is less at stake, fewer expectations. The brain responds to this reduction in stakes by lowering resistance. Small beginnings also interrupt habit loops. Habitual procrastination relies on automatic avoidance in response to discomfort. When you insert a small deliberate action at the moment of avoidance, the loop is disrupted. The brain expected relief from avoidance. Instead, it experiences engagement. If that engagement does not produce overwhelming discomfort, the prediction error is noted. The brain updates its model slightly. These updates are incremental. One small beginning does not rewire a habit. Repeated small beginnings do. Another important effect of starting is that it reveals information that planning cannot. Planning operates in abstraction. Starting reveals constraints, clarifies steps, and exposes what actually matters. Many tasks feel overwhelming because they are poorly specified. The brain does not know what to do first, second, or third. Starting forces specificity. It reveals what is unclear and what is straightforward. This clarity often reduces anxiety. Uncertainty is a major driver of avoidance. When uncertainty decreases, engagement becomes easier. It is also worth noting that small beginnings do not need to be productive in the traditional sense. They do not need to advance the task significantly. Their primary function is to change the brain state. Looking at the task, touching it, interacting with it briefly. These actions are enough to initiate that state change. This is why advice like "just start" is simultaneously correct and unhelpful. It points in the right direction, but ignores the scale of starting that the brain can tolerate. Telling someone to just start often implies starting in a meaningful, sustained way. That implication increases resistance. Starting small removes that implication. Another misconception is that small beginnings are a trick, that they are manipulative or dishonest, a way of fooling yourself into doing more than you intended. This framing can create resistance in people who value autonomy. In reality, small beginnings are honest. They acknowledge limits, they respect capacity, they do not promise more than they deliver. You're not committing to finish, you're committing to begin. This honesty matters. When the brain trusts that engagement will not escalate uncontrollably, it is more willing to participate. Small beginnings also reduce the emotional impact of stopping. If you begin with the understanding that you may stop at any time, stopping does not feel like failure. It feels like completion of the intended action. This reduces all or nothing thinking. You either did the small thing or you did not. There is no need to judge what happened next. Over time, this reframes the relationship with effort. Work becomes something you approach incrementally rather than something you either fully embrace or fully avoid. The brain adapts to this pattern. It learns that engagement does not automatically lead to exhaustion or overwhelm. It learns that effort can be modulated. This learning is especially important for people who have experienced burnout. Burnout teaches the brain that work is dangerous, that engagement leads to depletion. Small beginnings counter this lesson gently, without confrontation. They demonstrate that not all effort is draining, that some engagement is manageable. Another effect of starting is that it changes how time feels. Before starting, time related to the task feels vague. After starting, time becomes structured. Minutes pass, progress is measured, the future feels closer. This change in time perception increases urgency without stress. It creates a sense of movement rather than pressure. Small beginnings also interact with motivation in a subtle way. They do not create motivation out of nothing, but they create conditions under which motivation can emerge. As you engage, you may notice interest, or curiosity, or simply relief. These feelings are modest, but they are enough to support continuation. Importantly, if motivation does not appear, nothing has been lost. The goal was to begin, not to sustain. Ending after a small beginning is still a success. This redefinition of success is often uncomfortable at first. People are used to evaluating themselves based on outcomes, not on engagement. They may feel that small beginnings are insufficient or childish, but this discomfort often reflects internalized expectations rather than practical realities. The brain does not care whether a beginning looks impressive. It cares whether it feels safe. Small beginnings feel safer. Over time, as the brain's expectations shift, beginnings become easier. What once felt like a major hurdle becomes routine, not because the task has changed, but because the brain no longer treats the beginning as a threat. This does not mean resistance disappears entirely. Some days will still be harder, energy will still fluctuate, but the barrier is lower. Eventually starting becomes a neutral act rather than a charged one. This shift does not happen through insight alone. It happens through repetition, through many small starts that end without catastrophe. Another important aspect of small beginnings is that they create flexibility. When you're engaged, you can adjust, you can change approach, you can decide to stop or continue based on real feedback rather than imagined difficulty. Avoidance eliminates flexibility. It freezes the situation in its most threatening form. Starting, even briefly, reintroduces choice. This is why people often feel better after engaging with a task, even if they do not make much progress. They have broken the spell of anticipation. They have replaced imagination with experience. Experience is almost always less frightening than imagination. Small beginnings also have a cumulative effect. Each one reduces the emotional charge attached to the task. Over time, the task becomes familiar rather than intimidating. Familiarity reduces fear. Fear reduction reduces avoidance. This process is slow, but it is reliable. It does not depend on motivation, pressure, or inspiration. It depends on tolerable exposure. Another benefit of small beginnings is that they integrate well with real life. They do not require ideal conditions. They can be done when energy is low, time is limited, or focus is fragmented. This makes them sustainable. Sustainability matters more than intensity. Intense effort produces spikes. Sustainable effort produces change. As small beginnings accumulate, something else begins to shift. The environment itself starts to matter more. Where you begin, what is available to you, what distractions are present. Once starting is possible, the next question becomes how to make starting easier consistently, without relying on constant self-control. That question leads naturally toward the role of environment. Because while small beginnings can overcome resistance in the moment, the surrounding conditions determine how often those moments occur. Understanding how to shape the environment so that beginnings happen more naturally is the next step. Not by forcing behavior, but by reducing the friction that makes starting feel costly in the first place. For a long time, most conversations about procrastination have focused on the individual. Willpower, discipline, mindset, personal responsibility. The assumption underneath all of this is that the problem lives inside the person, and therefore the solution must also live there. If you could just think differently, try harder, or care more, the delay would disappear. But when you look closely at how behavior actually unfolds, that assumption starts to fall apart. People do not act in isolation. They act in environments, and those environments exert a quiet, constant influence on what feels easy, what feels difficult, and what feels almost impossible. Much of what we label as procrastination is not the result of weak character, but of environments that make avoidance effortless and engagement costly. This is why fighting yourself rarely works for long. When people try to overcome procrastination through sheer effort, they're often asking their brains to do something unnatural. They're asking them to resist immediate rewards, tolerate discomfort, ignore distractions, and maintain focus, all at the same time, and often in environments designed to undermine those very capacities. Even when this works temporarily, it is exhausting. It relies on constant self-monitoring and suppression of impulses. Eventually, fatigue sets in, habits reassert themselves, the environment wins. Changing the environment, by contrast, works quietly. It does not require constant effort. It does not rely on motivation. It shifts behavior by altering what the brain encounters before conscious choice even enters the picture. The brain is highly sensitive to cues. What is visible, accessible, and easy to interact with shapes behavior far more than abstract intentions. When a task is out of sight, it is often out of mind. When a distraction is within reach, it becomes a temptation whether you consciously want it or not. This is not a flaw. It is how attention works. Consider how often procrastination begins not with a deliberate decision to avoid, but with a small environmental trigger. A phone lighting up, a browser tab already open, a cluttered workspace that makes it unclear where to begin. These triggers nudge behavior in predictable directions. Once nudged, the brain follows the path of least resistance. This is why environment design is so powerful. It changes the path. Instead of asking yourself to resist distractions, you can make distractions harder to access. Instead of asking yourself to remember to start, you can make the task itself more visible. Instead of asking yourself to focus for long stretches, you can design shorter, more contained spaces for engagement. None of this requires willpower in the traditional sense. It relies on reducing friction for the behaviours you want and increasing friction for the behaviours you want less. Friction is an underappreciated concept in behaviour change. Even small amounts matter. When an action requires one extra step, it becomes less likely. When it requires one fewer step, it becomes more likely. The brain is extremely sensitive to these differences. Procrastination thrives in low-friction environments for avoidance. Distractions that are always available. Tasks that require setup before they can begin. Tools that are scattered. Instructions that are unclear. Each of these adds friction to engagement and removes friction from delay. Changing the environment reverses this balance. For example, if starting a task requires opening multiple files, finding notes, and deciding where to begin, the brain perceives high cost. If those materials are already prepared, visible, and organized, the cost drops. Starting becomes easier, not because you're more motivated, but because the barrier is lower. Similarly, if distractions require no effort to access, they will be accessed. If they require effort, even minor effort, their pull weakens. This does not eliminate temptation, but it creates a pause, and pauses matter. A pause is often enough to bring behavior back into awareness. Environment also influences how tasks are interpreted emotionally. A cluttered or chaotic space can increase stress and cognitive load. The brain feels overwhelmed before any work begins. Avoidance follows naturally. A simpler, more predictable environment reduces this background noise. It signals safety. It signals manageability. The brain becomes more willing to engage. This does not mean you need a perfect workspace. Perfectionism applied to environment can become another form of procrastination. The goal is not optimization, it is alignment. Alignment means that the environment supports the behavior you are trying to practice rather than working against it. One way this support shows up is through cues. Cues tell the brain what kind of behavior is expected in a given context. A bed cues rest. A dining table cues eating. A couch cues relaxation. When environments are used for many purposes at once, cues become confused. If the same space is used for work, entertainment, rest, and distraction, the brain receives mixed signals. Engagement becomes harder because the context does not clearly support it. Separating contexts even slightly can help. A specific chair, a specific corner, a specific surface that is used primarily for one kind of task. Over time, the brain learns to associate that context with engagement. This association does not require conscious effort. It forms through repetition. Another important aspect of environment is timing. When tasks are attached to specific times, the environment of time itself becomes a cue. Morning, afternoon, evening. These periods carry different associations and energy levels. Trying to do demanding work at times that consistently produce fatigue increases resistance. This resistance is often misinterpreted as laziness or lack of motivation. In reality, it is a mismatch between task demands and physiological state. Aligning tasks with energy rhythms reduces friction. It makes engagement more likely without requiring force. Environment also includes social context. The presence or absence of other people changes behavior. Some people find it easier to focus when others are working nearby. Others need solitude. Some feel pressure in shared spaces. Others feel supported. There is no universal solution here. The key is noticing how different social environments affect your own engagement and adjusting accordingly. For example, working alone with constant online access may increase distraction for some people. Working in a public or semi-public space may increase focus simply because behavior feels more observable, even if no one is paying attention. This is not about accountability in a moral sense. It is about how the brain responds to perceived social presence. Environment also includes digital spaces, the layout of a screen, the number of open tabs, the arrangement of apps. These factors shape attention continuously. Digital environments are often designed to encourage switching, not staying. Notifications interrupt, interfaces refresh, new content appears automatically. This constant novelty undermines sustained engagement. Changing digital environments does not require abandoning technology. It requires intentional limits, fewer open tabs, notifications disabled or delayed, work tools separated from entertainment tools. These changes reduce the frequency of interruption and the temptation to switch tasks. Over time, this reduces cognitive fatigue and increases tolerance for focus. Another important environmental factor is how tasks are defined. Vague tasks create high cognitive load. Clear tasks reduce it. A task labelled "work on project" is ambiguous. The brain does not know what that means or how to begin. A task labelled "open document" and write 3 sentences is concrete. It has a clear entry point and a clear end point. The environment of the task itself becomes more supportive. This kind of definition is not about productivity tricks. It is about reducing uncertainty. The brain avoids uncertainty. When uncertainty is removed, engagement becomes easier. Environment also shapes expectations. If you expect to be interrupted, you are less likely to begin. If you expect to be able to stop at any time, you are more likely to start. Creating environments where stopping is allowed and acceptable reduces the fear of starting. This might mean working in shorter sessions, or choosing locations where interruptions are less stressful, or setting explicit limits on duration. These boundaries create psychological safety. The brain is more willing to engage when it knows the effort is contained. One of the most common mistakes people make is trying to change themselves before changing their environment. They attempt to cultivate focus, discipline, or motivation in the same conditions that undermine those qualities in the first place. This is like trying to swim upstream while insisting the current should not matter. The current always matters. Changing the environment is not an admission of weakness. It is an acknowledgement of how human brains work. Even the most disciplined individuals rely heavily on structure, routine, and environment to support their behavior. What often appears as exceptional self-control is, in reality, well-designed context. Another benefit of environmental change is that it reduces the need for self-judgment. When behavior improves due to environmental shifts, there is less temptation to interpret success or failure as personal virtue or flaw. The focus moves away from identity and toward conditions. This shift is psychologically healthier. It reduces shame. It increases curiosity. It encourages experimentation. Instead of asking, "Why can't I make myself do this?" the question becomes, "What conditions make this easier or harder?" That question leads to practical adjustments rather than self-criticism. Environment-based approaches also scale better. They work on days when motivation is low, when energy is limited, and when stress is high. They do not require you to be at your best. This reliability is important. Procrastination often returns during difficult periods not because lessons were forgotten, but because capacity was reduced. Environments that support engagement during low-capacity periods prevent backsliding. Another subtle advantage of changing the environment is that it changes how progress feels. When engagement happens more easily, progress feels less dramatic but more consistent. There are fewer crises, fewer all-nighters, fewer guilt cycles. This consistency rebuilds trust in yourself, trust that starting does not require suffering, trust that effort can be manageable, that trust, once established, becomes self-reinforcing. It is also important to recognize that environmental change does not need to be extreme. Small adjustments often have outsized effects. Moving a phone out of reach, preparing materials in advance, closing unnecessary apps, choosing a consistent starting cue. These changes may seem trivial, but the brain responds to them immediately. One reason people resist environmental change is that it feels external. It feels like avoiding the real issue. There is a belief that unless behavior changes from the inside, it is not genuine. This belief is misplaced. Internal change often follows external change. Behavior shapes belief as much as belief shapes behavior. When you engage more easily, you begin to see yourself differently, not as someone who procrastinates, but as someone who can begin under the right conditions. Identity shifts quietly. Another resistance comes from the desire to be flexible. People worry that structure will make them rigid or constrained, but structure and rigidity are not the same thing. Good structure reduces unnecessary decisions. It creates freedom by removing friction. It allows energy to be spent on the task itself rather than on deciding whether and how to begin. Poor structure, by contrast, creates constant negotiation. That negotiation is exhausting. Environment also interacts with habit formation. When the same context reliably cues engagement, starting becomes automatic. The habit loop shifts. The cue triggers action rather than avoidance. This is one of the most durable ways to reduce procrastination, not by breaking habits through force, but by replacing them through repetition in supportive contexts. Importantly, this does not require eliminating all sources of comfort or distraction. It requires managing access, creating zones and times where engagement is easier than avoidance. The goal is not to create a perfect environment. It is to create one that is good enough to support the behavior you want most of the time. There will still be days when avoidance wins. That does not negate the value of environmental change. Habits weaken gradually. Patterns shift slowly. The measure of success is not perfection, but reduced friction and faster recovery. As environments become more supportive, another change often occurs. People stop seeing procrastination as an enemy to defeat and start seeing it as information, a signal that something about the conditions needs adjustment. This reframing reduces internal conflict. The brain is no longer fighting itself, it is responding to context. And when context improves, behavior follows. Changing the environment does not solve everything. It does not eliminate uncertainty, effort, or discomfort, but it makes those experiences tolerable. It lowers the threshold for engagement. It reduces reliance on pressure and motivation. Once engagement becomes easier, the relationship with time itself begins to change. Time stops feeling like something to argue with or outrun. It becomes something you move alongside. That shift from fighting time to living with it is subtle but profound. It marks the point where procrastination loses its grip not through force but through alignment. And it leads naturally into the final piece of this exploration: how to exist with time in a way that does not require constant resistance, self-blame, or last-minute panic. There is a quiet tension that runs beneath much of procrastination, a tension that rarely gets named directly. It is the sense that time is something to wrestle with, something to beat, escape, negotiate with, or make up for later. Time becomes an adversary, always moving faster than expected, always asking for more than feels available. Living this way is exhausting. When time is treated as an opponent, every delay feels like a failure and every deadline feels like an ambush. The mind stays slightly braced, always aware of what should have been done already, or what will soon demand attention. Even moments of rest carry a low-level unease, because rest feels undeserved when time is perceived as scarce. Procrastination thrives in this tension, because delay becomes both the problem and the temporary solution. Waiting offers relief from the pressure of time, even as it makes that pressure worse later. The cycle repeats not because people enjoy it, but because they have not learned another way to relate to time. Living with time instead of arguing with it begins with a shift in perspective. Time is not a moral force. It does not reward virtue or punish weakness. It does not care about intentions, guilt, or effort. It simply passes. Most of the suffering around procrastination comes not from time itself, but from the stories people tell about it. Stories about being behind, about having wasted it, about needing to catch up. These stories add emotional weight to each moment, making engagement feel heavier than it needs to be. When time is framed as something already lost or insufficient, starting feels futile. Why begin now if you are already behind? Why try if you cannot do it perfectly or on schedule? This framing quietly encourages avoidance. Living with time means abandoning the idea that there is a correct pace everyone should be following. It means recognizing that capacity fluctuates, attention shifts, and progress is rarely linear. Time does not demand constant output. It accommodates variation, whether you acknowledge it or not. The brain struggles when expectations about time are rigid. When every moment is expected to be productive, any deviation feels like failure. This creates pressure. Pressure fuels avoidance. Avoidance creates more pressure. A more workable relationship with time accepts that not all moments are equal. Some moments are suited for effort. Others are suited for rest, reflection, or recovery. Trying to force effort into moments that cannot support it leads to frustration and delay. This does not mean waiting passively for perfect conditions. It means responding to conditions realistically. Living with time also involves letting go of the idea that progress must be constant to be meaningful. Small, irregular steps still accumulate. Engagement that happens in short bursts still counts. There is no cosmic scoreboard tracking daily output. The brain benefits from this reframing because it reduces threat. When time is no longer treated as a judge, starting feels less risky. You're not proving anything to time, you are simply acting within it. Another important aspect of living with time is accepting that delay is part of human behaviour. It will happen occasionally, even with the best systems and intentions. Treating every delay as a crisis magnifies its impact. Treating it as information reduces it. When you notice delay without judgment, you can ask useful questions. Was the task unclear? Was energy low? Was the environment working against you? These questions invite adjustment rather than blame. Blame locks people into arguments with the past. Adjustment allows movement in the present. Living with time also means shifting attention away from regret. Regret focuses on what should have been done earlier. While reflection can be helpful, regret often consumes energy without producing insight. It keeps attention anchored to moments that can no longer be changed. The brain responds better to forward-facing information. What can be done now? What is possible with the time available? These questions are grounded in reality rather than comparison. This shift is subtle, but it changes how starting feels. Instead of starting late, you're starting now. Instead of catching up, you are engaging. Engagement does not require justification. It does not need to be perfect or efficient. It only needs to be possible. Another way people argue with time is by treating future time as compensation for present discomfort. The idea that things will be easier later, that there will be more time, more energy, more clarity. This belief supports delay but often leads to disappointment. Living with time means recognizing that future time will be shaped by the same constraints as present time. It will include interruptions, fatigue, and competing demands. It will not be a clean slate. This recognition is not pessimistic. It is grounding. It encourages realistic planning rather than hopeful postponement. At the same time, living with time does not mean becoming rigid or mechanical. It means allowing flexibility without illusion. Plans can change, priorities can shift, but these changes are responses to reality, not escapes from it. Another aspect of living with time is making peace with unfinishedness. Many tasks do not have clear endings. They evolve, they improve gradually. Waiting for a sense of completion before feeling satisfied can keep people perpetually dissatisfied. Accepting partial progress reduces the urge to delay. If something can be worked on imperfectly and still be worthwhile, starting becomes less fraught. The brain relaxes when it does not have to reach a finish line to justify effort. Living with time also involves recalibrating expectations around urgency. Not everything needs to feel urgent to matter. Urgency is a tool, not a requirement. When urgency becomes the only way to act, calm engagement feels impossible. By allowing some tasks to proceed without pressure, you teach the brain that action does not always require threat. This reduces reliance on last-minute panic and makes engagement more sustainable. Another quiet change that comes with living with time is patience with yourself. Not indulgence, but patience. Recognizing that change unfolds gradually, that habits shift slowly, that some days will feel easier than others. Impatience often fuels procrastination by creating unrealistic demands. When progress is expected to be immediate, any resistance feels like failure. Delay follows. Patience reframes resistance as part of the process rather than a sign that something is wrong. Living with time also means recognizing when to stop pushing. Rest is not a reward for productivity. It is a requirement for functioning. Ignoring this creates cycles of overexertion and avoidance. When rest is treated as legitimate, procrastination decreases because the brain no longer has to steal rest through avoidance. It can recover openly rather than covertly. This distinction matters. Many people procrastinate not because they do not want to work, but because they are too tired to continue. Avoidance becomes the only way to rest. Honoring rest reduces this dynamic. Another important element is redefining what it means to be on time. Being on time does not always mean meeting an external deadline perfectly. It can mean responding appropriately to your own capacity and the demands of the moment. Sometimes being on time means starting earlier. Sometimes it means starting later but with full attention. Sometimes it means not starting at all and choosing recovery instead. These choices are not failures, they are adjustments. Living with time also means letting go of comparison. Other people's pace, output, and schedules are not useful benchmarks. They reflect different constraints, resources, and priorities. Comparison fuels impatience and shame, both of which increase avoidance. Focusing on your own conditions leads to more accurate decisions. The brain performs better when it is not constantly measuring itself against imagined standards. As people begin to live with time rather than argue with it, procrastination loses much of its emotional charge. Delay becomes less dramatic. Starting becomes less loaded. Tasks are approached with curiosity rather than dread. This does not eliminate difficulty. It changes how difficulty is held. Instead of thinking, "I should have done this already," the thought becomes, "This is where I am starting." That shift is small, but it alters the entire tone of engagement. It reduces internal conflict. It frees up energy that was previously spent on self-criticism. Living with time also changes how people relate to plans. Plans become guides rather than contracts. They provide direction without demanding perfection. When plans are adjusted, it is not a breach. It is a response. This flexibility reduces the fear of planning, which often fuels procrastination. If plans are allowed to evolve, making them feel safer. Another benefit of this approach is that it rebuilds trust. Trust that starting does not require heroics. Trust that effort can be steady rather than explosive. Trust that time does not need to be conquered to be used well. This trust accumulates slowly, through experience, through days where engagement happens without crisis, through moments where starting feels ordinary rather than dramatic. Over time, procrastination becomes less central. It does not disappear entirely, but it loses its power to define behavior. The brain learns that it does not need to wait for pressure, motivation, or perfect conditions. It can engage within the flow of time as it is, not as it wishes it were. This is not a productivity philosophy. It is a way of reducing unnecessary struggle. When you stop arguing with time, you stop fighting yourself. The two were never separate. And as that realization settles in, something else becomes possible. Work becomes less about proving worth and more about participating in the moment. Effort becomes something you enter and exit, not something that consumes you. Time continues to pass as it always has. But instead of chasing it or resisting it, you move alongside it, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, always imperfectly, and that for most people is enough to begin again, without urgency, without judgment, and without waiting for a future moment that never quite arrives.